The buyers were 5 minutes early, which was how Ruth happened to hear the question. She was in the kitchen with her good blouse buttoned over her work shirt, sliding Daniel's rosemary chicken from the oven because he had forgotten to set a timer. Through the screen door came the crunch of tires, Elise's quick laugh, and Daniel beginning his practice speech about the view from the upper ridge. A woman interrupted him. "I'm sorry. Where's Ruth Mercer?" The back porch went quiet. Ruth set the roasting pan on the stove. Daniel had told her to stay inside until they finished the tour. Elise had called it giving the buyers room to imagine the property as their own. "My mother's resting," Daniel said at last. At 6 o'clock, another silence, then a man's voice, courteous but firm. "We came to meet Mrs. Mercer. We're not walking the orchard without her." Ruth looked down at the mud dried along the seams of her boots. 10 minutes earlier, her children had agreed those boots would make the family look desperate. Now the strangers outside were refusing to take another step until they saw her. 4 weeks before that evening, Daniel had brought a glossy brochure to Sunday supper and placed it beside Ruth's salt shaker. She noticed it without picking it up. The cover showed two silver-haired people holding wine glasses on a porch that had never seen rain, arthritis, or a bird's nest in the gutter. Behind them, gentle hills glowed gold in the sunset. "What are they selling?" Ruth asked. "Dentures?" Elise choked on her water. Daniel did not laugh. "It's a concept package. That clears it right up. They were at the oak table George had bought second-hand in 1989, back when one corner of the kitchen floor dipped enough to roll a marble under the refrigerator. George had fixed the floor. The table still leaned. Daniel reached across the green beans and turned the brochure toward her. "Mercer Ridge," the cover said in narrow white letters. "Distinctive country living." Ruth read it twice. Outside the kitchen windows, the orchard descended in darkening rows toward the creek. The early apples had been picked, leaving the wine saps and pippins to deepen through October. In the far block, Calvin's tractor sat where a hydraulic line had split that afternoon. "There is no Mercer Ridge," she said. "It's just a working name. It's a hill, Daniel. Calling it a ridge won't make it taller." Elise wiped her mouth, carefully hiding another smile. At 41, she still had the same betraying mouth she'd had at 20. Everything else about her was controlled. Blunt blonde bob, small gold hoops, cream sweater without a speck of lint. She designed hotel interiors in Richmond and could make a room look expensive by removing half the furniture. Daniel, 2 years older, looked as though he'd come straight from his restaurant, though Ruth knew Ash Oak was closed Sundays. His beard was trimmed close, and his sleeves were folded exactly twice. When he was nervous, he became neater. He nudged the brochure closer. "Can we have one serious conversation?" "We can have 6. I'm not drinking wine on that porch. No one said you had to." "Then why am I in the picture?" "You're not in the picture," Elise said. Ruth lifted her eyebrows. "That came out wrong. It came out efficient." The wall clock ticked above the telephone. On the counter, Ruth's apple cake waited beneath a clean dish towel. She had made it because Daniel liked the crisp edges and Elise liked the soft middle, though each claimed not to eat dessert anymore. Daniel took a breath. "A development group has been buying land west of Charlottesville. Low-density homes, expensive homes. They're looking for properties with views, road access, a story. We have all 3. We?" He looked toward Elise, but Elise became interested in a green bean. Ruth had heard that small word many times since George died. "We should get the roof checked. We need to think about your driving at night. We can't keep pretending this place runs itself." Though we always included Ruth when there was work and excluded her when there was a decision. Daniel flattened his hand on the brochure. "You know what I mean? I'd like to. The orchard is too much for you." There it was, not concern dressed as a question. A sentence laid on the table like a medical result. Ruth put down her fork. "I was on the tractor this morning. That is not the defense you think it is. The tractor and I both survived. You shouldn't be doing that kind of work. I drove it from the west block to the shed, because a hydraulic line blew, which I noticed before the pump burned out." Daniel's jaw shifted. "Mom, you're 69. Thank God you came. I'd lost count." Elise said, "Nobody thinks you're incompetent." "Good. I'd hate to have misunderstood the brochure." "This is exactly why we waited to bring it up," Daniel said. Ruth looked at him. "You waited?" The question caught him. His hand moved off the brochure. Elise reached for her water. "We've discussed it generally." "How generally, Mom?" "How long have you two been discussing what's too much for me?" Daniel pushed back from the table, then seemed to think better of standing. Since you fell, I slipped on ice. You broke your hip. I had it repaired. That's what hospitals are for. You were alone for 6 hours. 3. 3 is not better. Ruth looked through the window at the reflection of the kitchen laid over the orchard. George's chair was empty at the head of the table. She had stopped setting a place there after the first year, but had never moved the chair. The fall had happened 7 months after his funeral. She had gone out before sunrise to check a frozen irrigation coupling, stepped off the packing house ramp, and landed in a strip of ice hidden beneath blown leaves. Her phone had been inside. She had dragged herself close enough to the shed wall to reach an extension cord and yanked until a work lamp crashed loudly enough for Calvin, arriving early to hear it. Daniel had driven from Richmond so fast, he got a ticket. Elise had slept in the hospital chair for 2 nights, waking every time Ruth moved. Their fear had been real. Ruth knew that. Knowing it did not make their current tone easier to bear. I hired help, she said. You hired more help, Daniel answered. That's different. Calvin has supervised field crews for 12 years. Nora runs the packing house better than your father ever did. I do not climb ladders. I don't lift picking bins. I don't spray. My doctor cleared me to drive. You still work every day, Elise said more softly. So do you. I don't work around equipment that can kill me. You choose wallpaper for men who say taupe is too political. We all have hazards. That earned a sound from Elise, half laugh and half surrender. Daniel stared at his plate. Ruth wanted to let the joke release the pressure. Sunday supper had survived George's death, Daniel's first restaurant closing, Elise's divorce, 2 election years, and a memorable argument over whether air fryers counted as frying. She did not want a development brochure to be the thing that broke it. Then Daniel said, "Last season barely broke even." Ruth's amusement vanished. "Last season paid every bill. That isn't the same thing. It is to the people who sent them. There's deferred maintenance everywhere. Irrigation, cold storage, the north roof. You're using cash accounting to pretend costs don't exist. You've been through my books. You gave me access when Dad got sick for that year. You never changed it." Elise's gaze moved from Daniel to Ruth. That, at least, seemed to be new information to her. Daniel saw it too. I wasn't spying. I was trying to understand the situation. The situation being my business. The situation being our family's only significant asset. Ruth heard George in that sentence. Not his voice exactly, but his way of turning worry into arithmetic. George had loved the orchard and complained about it like a bad knee. In lean years, he threatened to sell. In good years, he bought another piece of equipment and called it prudence. He had also believed land was the one thing a family should never be foolish enough to lose. Ruth folded her napkin. "The orchard is mine." Neither child spoke. She hated the silence more than an argument. It made her sound greedy, as if she had claimed the last piece of cake. George's will had been plain because their lives had been plain. Everything to the surviving spouse. Someday, whatever remained would pass equally to Daniel and Elise. Ruth had never considered that arrangement a source of power. Until that moment, she had not understood that they considered it a waiting period. Elise leaned forward. "No one is disputing that." "Then stop calling it ours when you mean yours later." "That isn't fair," Daniel said. "Isn't it? I'm trying to keep you from spending the next 10 years pouring money and your health into something that's already taken most of your life." Ruth's fingers tightened around the napkin. He must have seen it, because his expression changed. For a second, he was not a polished restaurant owner talking about assets. He was a tired son who had watched both parents miss dinners, postpone trips, and come to family events smelling faintly of sulfur spray. But then he added, "At your age, there has to be a point where you admit the work isn't worth it," Elise whispered. "Daniel." "What?" "We're all thinking it." "No," Ruth said. "You're thinking it. Elise is waiting to see if you survive saying it." Elise closed her eyes. Daniel rubbed a hand over his beard. "You're too old to keep running an orchard this size alone." Ruth looked past him to the counter, where the cake sat beneath its towel. That morning, she had pared the apples with George's old carbon steel knife. She had added less sugar because Daniel complained everything was too sweet now. She had arranged the slices in the pan because Elise once said they tasted better when they overlapped. Too old for the orchard. Not tired, not injured, not allowed to change. Too old, as if age had arrived on a certain birthday and canceled everything she knew. She stood and began clearing plates. "Mom, sit down," Elise said. "I'm getting dessert. We don't need dessert. I know. I made it anyway." Daniel stood. "Please don't do this." Ruth carried the plates to the sink. "Do what? Turn every conversation into proof we don't appreciate you." She set the plates down more carefully than necessary. "You brought advertising materials for Houses on My Land to dinner. It's information. It has a name, a working name. It has a picture, Daniel. The broker made a preliminary presentation. That's all." Ruth turned. "The broker?" Again, that caught him. Elise looked at Daniel with open irritation now. "You said you were going to tell her." "I am telling her." "No, you're telling her around it." Ruth waited. Daniel's restaurant face settled over him. The expression he used when a customer found a hair on a plate, and he needed to decide whether to apologize or challenge the evidence. "A broker is coming Tuesday," he said. "To do what?" "Walk the property. Give us a realistic valuation. You invited a stranger to value my orchard before asking whether I wanted to sell it. It's not a commitment." "Tuesday when?" 10. Ruth nodded once. Daniel seemed relieved, mistaking the movement for acceptance. She crossed to the counter and uncovered the cake. Its top was brown and uneven, the edges pulled cleanly from the pan. She cut 3 pieces. Daniel started to say he didn't want one, then stopped when she set the crisp corner in front of him. They ate in the peculiar quiet of people who had hurt one another, and were not yet ready to lose dessert too. Afterward, Elise washed dishes without being asked. Daniel carried scraps to the compost bucket. Their bodies remembered how to help, even while their minds were making plans against her. At the door, Elise hugged Ruth longer than usual. "We're worried," she said into Ruth's hair. "I know. That doesn't mean we think you're useless." "I didn't say it did." Elise stepped back, looking almost disappointed that Ruth had not made the accusation easier to answer. Daniel kissed Ruth's cheek. "Tuesday is just a conversation." Ruth watched their taillights disappear between the first rows of trees. Then she went back to the table and opened the brochure. Inside were watercolor maps of narrow roads curving through places where her wine saps stood. The packing house had become a residents' gathering barn. Her own house was marked Heritage Clubhouse. Small blue ponds appeared where no water had ever willingly stayed. On the final page, beneath a paragraph about preserving the Mercer family legacy, was Daniel's email address. Ruth sat alone under the ticking clock, one hand resting on the glossy paper. Tuesday was not going to be just a conversation. It was going to be the first time her children learned that silence and surrender were not the same thing. The brochure was still on the table when Ruth came down before daylight. She turned it face down, made coffee, and carried both the mug and her irritation to the orchard office. The office occupied one end of the packing house, behind a door that swelled in wet weather. George had called it the nerve center, though it contained a metal desk, 2 filing cabinets, a dead fly strip, and a heater that smelled like toast when first switched on. Ruth opened the accounting program and studied the figures Daniel had mentioned. He was not wrong about everything. That was the inconvenient part. The north cold storage unit had limped through summer with a borrowed compressor. 3 irrigation valves needed replacing before spring. The packing house roof leaked above the grading belt, and Nora had placed a blue barrel beneath it so long ago that everyone treated the barrel as permanent architecture. Ruth printed the maintenance list. Then she printed the balance sheet, the previous season's profit and loss statement, and the current crop contracts. She was feeding the papers into a red folder when Calvin came in, wiping his boots on a feed sack. "You get lost?" he asked. "Apparently I've been lost for years." Calvin paused. He was 58, lean as a fence rail, with a white mustache that made every expression look skeptical. "Coffee ready?" "In the house." "Then I'll come back when you're less dangerous." She held up the maintenance list. "How bad is the north unit?" "It's not good." "Is it bad?" "It has moods." "Calvin." He removed his cap. "It can get us through harvest if Amos keeps answering his phone. I wouldn't trust it next summer. And the roof? It'll leak." Insightful. "You asked." Ruth leaned back in George's chair. It squeaked in the same place it always had. "What else have I been putting off?" Calvin glanced at the papers, then at her. "This about Daniel's email?" Her chair stopped squeaking. "What email?" "He said a property broker was coming and asked me to move the broken sprayer behind the equipment barn." "When did he ask?" "Friday." Sunday's conversation had not been an ambush improvised over green beans. It had been the courtesy notice after arrangements were made. Did you move it? No. Why not? It doesn't run. That has never stopped you from moving anything before. He didn't ask you. Calvin put his cap back on. It was a tiny gesture, but Ruth understood it. He had answered to George once, and to Ruth now. He was not going to let Daniel slip into the empty place between them without being invited. Move it this morning, she said. Calvin's eyebrows rose. The broker should see the ground beneath it. There may be a fuel stain. There isn't. I put a pan under it. Then the pan can impress her. As he reached the door, Ruth said, Cal! He turned. If this place had to run without me tomorrow, what breaks first? He considered it seriously. That was why she asked him, and not Daniel. Nothing tomorrow, he said. By next Thursday, the packing schedule. By the week after, 3 customers are angry because nobody called them back. By the end of the month, Nora quits because Daniel says workflow at her one too many times. Ruth smiled despite herself. Calvin did not. You planning to go somewhere? I'm planning not to be flattered by my own importance. That sounds unpleasant. It is. Nora Ruiz was sorting invoices at the grading table when Ruth entered the main room. She wore reading glasses attached to a purple beaded chain and had a pencil stuck through her bun. A radio played country music beneath the rumble of the belt. Before you ask, Nora said, I did not reply to Daniel. What did he want from you? Production numbers, staff list, vendor contacts. He said it was for a family planning meeting. Did you send anything? I sent him your phone number. Ruth rested both palms on the table. He still has access to the books from when George was sick. Nora removed her glasses. You want me to change it? Ruth almost said yes. The word was ready. Then she imagined Daniel receiving an automated notice that morning, arriving Tuesday already armed with the accusation that she was hiding something. Not yet. Nora studied her face. That answer is going to make me drink more coffee. Put it on the company account. I already do. At 9:57 the next morning, a dark blue sedan stopped beside the house. Daniel's truck was already there. He had arrived at 9:15 wearing boots too clean to have touched soil and spent half an hour moving flower pots off the porch. The red geraniums looked cluttered, he had explained. They're flowers. There were 9 pots. They breed at night. Elise pulled in behind the sedan and emerged carrying a cardboard tray of coffee. She handed one to Ruth, as if arriving late with caffeine made her neutral. The broker introduced herself as Meredith Sloan. She was in her mid-50s, compact and silver-haired, wearing a navy rain shell and boots with dried mud already on them. That made Ruth like her slightly more than she wanted to. Mrs. Mercer, Meredith said, shaking her hand. Thank you for letting me visit. Ruth is fine, and I haven't decided what I'm letting anybody do. Meredith nodded without flinching. Fair enough. Daniel stepped in. We thought we'd start at the house, go through the packing facilities, then drive up to the ridge. Upper Hill, Ruth said. Meredith looked from Daniel to Ruth. The ridge is in the brochure, Ruth explained. The hill is on the property. Elise pushed a coffee into Daniel's hand. Drink. They began at the house. Meredith measured no rooms and opened no closets. She examined the foundation, asked about the well, and photographed the view from the porch. Daniel supplied dates, some accurately. When he said the kitchen had been fully renovated in 2012, Ruth corrected him. Cabinets and counters. The wiring is older. I was simplifying. Electricity dislikes that. Meredith made a note. They moved toward the packing house. The morning was cool and smelled of wet leaves and crushed fruit. Beyond the loading area, 2 workers stacked empty bins beneath the awning. Daniel waved at them with the open-handed friendliness of someone visiting a business where everyone knew his name but not his schedule. The orchard currently has roughly 36 productive acres, he told Meredith. 34 and a half, Ruth said. If you're counting the creek block, you shouldn't. The survey says 36. The trees say otherwise. Meredith looked toward Ruth. Drainage? Flooding twice in 5 years. We stopped replanting there. Daniel sipped his coffee. For development purposes, it's still acreage. For development purposes, it's still wet. Meredith made another note. Ruth could not tell whose point the note favored. Inside the packing house, Nora stood beside the grading line, glasses on, pencil in place. Daniel gave her a smile. Nora, you remember my sister, Elise. I packed her Christmas pears. Elise brightened. Those were beautiful. They were pears. Meredith asked Nora how long she had worked there. 26 years. And Mrs. Mercer handles operations? Nora looked directly at Ruth before answering. Ruth handles Ruth's part. Calvin handles Calvin's. I handle the part they'd ruin. Meredith smiled. Daniel did not. They examined the cold rooms. Amos had coaxed the north unit into a steady hum, but its temperature display flickered between 35 and 88, briefly suggesting they were storing apples in a sauna. That needs repair, Ruth said. We have a service appointment, Daniel added. Ruth turned to him. We do? I called someone. Who? Commercial Cooling Solutions. They stopped servicing this county. They took the appointment. They'll cancel tomorrow. Meredith watched them with professional stillness. Daniel shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. The point is, it's being addressed. No, Ruth said. The point is, you called a company from a search result without asking the person who operates the unit. Elise moved closer. Can we not do this here? Where would you like to do it? Somewhere Meredith isn't billing us by the hour. I'm billing no one today, Meredith said. This is an initial assessment. Daniel thanked her too warmly. They drove to the upper hill in Ruth's truck because Meredith's sedan would not clear the ruts. Ruth drove. Meredith sat beside her. Daniel and Elise squeezed onto the bench seat behind them, though the truck had never been designed with 3 adults in mind. Daniel's knee pressed against the back of Ruth's seat. You could move forward, he said. My feet need the pedals. You're shorter than I am. Then God has punished the right person. Meredith looked out the window, but Ruth saw the corner of her mouth twitch. At the upper block, rows of wine saps ran along the slope, their fruit dark red against thinning leaves. Several trunks were thick and twisted, graft scars folded into the bark. Daniel spread his arms toward the view. This is what the development group would be interested in. East-facing home sites, mountain views, enough elevation to... Why are those trees marked? Meredith asked Ruth. Blue bands circled every 5th trunk. Those are our primary pollinizers, different bloom timing. You can't see the difference from the fruit unless you know what you're looking for. And the white tags? Trial grafts. Some are old Virginia varieties, some are mistakes. Mistakes? Anybody who claims every graft takes is selling tape. Meredith stepped closer to one of the trees. She did not touch the tag. Daniel tried again. Obviously, agricultural use is one option. The highest value is residential. Probably, Meredith said. The simple agreement quieted everyone. She walked to the edge of the row and looked down across the packing house, the equipment barn, the old farmhouse, and the green corridor of the creek. Ruth had stood in that spot during drought, during hail, and once beside George when an early frost ruined enough blossoms to make him sit on the ground without speaking. Meredith turned. You could get substantial interest. Road improvements would be required, perk testing, environmental review, possibly a redesigned entrance. But the setting is marketable. How substantial? Daniel asked. Too early for a reliable number. A range? Meredith gave one. Even the low end was more than Ruth had expected. Elise inhaled softly. Daniel became very still. Ruth looked at the wine saps. A number that large did strange things to ordinary objects. The truck seemed suddenly old enough to replace. The leaking roof became absurd. The hospital bill she had paid in installments became nothing. Daniel's restaurant debt, whatever it was, could vanish. Elise could stop pretending her divorce had not halved her finances. Ruth could leave before another hard freeze. She could sleep through rain without wondering where the roof leaked. Meredith must have read something in her face. That's not an offer, she said, and selling for development is neither quick nor simple. But possible, Daniel said. Possible. They returned to the house and sat at the same table where the brochure had first appeared. Meredith described appraisals, land use questions, agricultural buyers, and developers who might pay more but demand long contingencies. She was careful, never pushing. What do you want? She finally asked Ruth. Daniel answered. We want to understand all our options. Meredith kept her eyes on Ruth. Ruth ran one finger along a scratch George had made, dragging a canning pot across the table. I'll hear offers, she said. Daniel exhaled. All offers, Ruth continued, agricultural included. Nobody enters the property without my approval. Nobody speaks to my employees about their jobs except me. And nothing gets promised, announced, designed, named, or printed without my signature. Elise looked at the brochure. Daniel said, Of course. Ruth met his eyes. You said that too fast. Meredith closed her notebook. I'll put the conditions in writing. After they left, Daniel stayed behind on the porch. You heard the number, he said. I did. This could change all our lives. Ruth picked up the red geranium pot he had moved and set it back beside the step. It already has, she said. Daniel did not wait for Meredith's written conditions before sending Ruth a list titled Property Readiness. It arrived at 6:12 the next morning with 17 items, each assigned a color. Red meant urgent, yellow meant before photography, and green meant quality of presentation. The broken sprayer was red. The geraniums were yellow. Removing personal clutter from the farmhouse was green. Ruth read it twice while standing at the kitchen counter. Then she replied, The geraniums stay. Daniel answered before she finished her coffee. Fine. She did not trust a surrender that short. At the packing house, Nora and Calvin were waiting in the office. They had positioned themselves in the two metal chairs opposite George's desk, like applicants for the same unpleasant job. You called a meeting, Nora said. I said stop by. You used a period. That means meeting. Ruth remained standing. She had practiced the words while walking down from the house. None sounded right now. I'm allowing Meredith Sloan to bring offers for the property. Nora's pencil stopped halfway to her bun. Calvin asked, Whole property? That depends on the offer. You selling the business too? I am listening. I haven't decided anything. Nora took off her glasses. Those are different answers. I know. What happens to us? I don't know yet. Ruth hated saying it. For 26 years, Nora had known which doors to lock, which growers paid late, which temporary workers needed advances before they would ask. Calvin had missed only 4 workdays in 12 years, 2 for influenza and 2 when his second wife left him and took the coffee maker. They deserved certainty. Ruth had none to give. No one will hear news about their job from Daniel, she said, or Elise. If anything changes, it comes from me. Calvin leaned back. Daniel emailed me again. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. What now? Wants the equipment barn organized by Friday. Says Meredith may schedule photography. She hasn't. Figured. Nora watched Ruth. You want us to ignore him? Yes. That I can do. Calvin stood, but his hand lingered on the back of the chair. You tired of it? The question was gentler than Ruth expected. Some days. The orchard or them? Nora said. Calvin. What? It matters. Ruth looked through the office window. On the grating floor, 3 women were packing wine saps into divided cartons. Each apple was turned stem up before the lid closed. George had thought that was unnecessary, until Nora showed him how many customers opened a box and judged it before tasting anything. I don't know, Ruth said. Calvin nodded as if uncertainty were a valid answer. Daniel would have turned it into a symptom. Meredith sent the agreement that afternoon. Ruth read every page, crossed out a sentence allowing unaccompanied showings, and added that agricultural operations took precedence over appointments. When Daniel called, he said the edits made her sound hostile. To whom? Potential buyers. They haven't met me yet. That is exactly my concern. She signed only after Meredith accepted the changes. For 3 days, nothing happened. The orchard continued with insulting normality. Trucks arrived late. A restaurant rejected 2 crates because one apple had a blemish no larger than a shirt button. The north cold storage unit dropped to 31 degrees, rose to 40, then returned to 35 before Amos could find his voltage meter. Ruth spent Thursday afternoon on the telephone pricing a new compressor. The first estimate made her laugh. The second made her stop. When she hung up, George's old calculator sat beside her elbow. The 8 key stuck unless pressed hard. She entered the figure for the compressor, then the roof, then the spring valve replacements. Daniel's substantial number floated behind every smaller one. She hated that the possibility of selling made repairs look foolish. She hated more that keeping the orchard did not make them affordable. On Saturday morning, a white van marked clear space. Organizing services came up the drive. Ruth was at the back door in slippers, holding a bowl of oatmeal. Elise stepped from the passenger side, wearing jeans and a canvas jacket, her hair tied back. A woman in black leggings emerged from the driver's side and opened the van. Ruth set the oatmeal on the porch rail. What is this? Don't be mad. Drive back down and try again. Eliza, that's a better start. Elise climbed the steps. Meredith needs exterior and interior photographs. I thought I could help make the house look its best. And the woman unloading empty boxes? That's Celia. We work together. She stages residential properties. I'm not selling a condominium, no. You're possibly selling a farmhouse with 40 years of objects on every horizontal surface. Ruth glanced through the kitchen window. A basket of unopened mail sat on one chair. George's binoculars remained on the sill, though one eyepiece had been broken for 6 years. 3 seed catalogs occupied the counter beside a ceramic hen Daniel had made in a pottery class and denied making ever since. Celia is not touching George's things. Elise's expression softened. No one is asking you to throw them away. The van's rear doors opened. Daniel emerged carrying flattened cartons. Ruth stared at him. Were you hiding? There's one passenger seat. You have your own truck. It seemed wasteful. Celia approached with the cautious cheer of someone entering a family argument professionally. She was around Elise's age, with a long braid and bright orange glasses. Mrs. Mercer? I'm only here to pack what you approve. We can start with excess kitchen items, or I can go away and let you all discuss. Ruth liked her immediately, which was irritating. You may pack the ceramic hen, Ruth said. Daniel frowned. What ceramic hen? Exactly. They began in the kitchen. Celia labeled each carton in large block letters. Elise wrapped glassware. Daniel carried boxes to the dining room, where they would remain rather than disappear into his car. Ruth established that rule twice. At first, the work felt invasive. Every drawer became an argument with her younger self. 6 corkscrews, a flour sifter rusted shut, 27 takeout menus, including one for a Chinese restaurant that had closed before George died. What if they reopen? Ruth asked. The phone number belongs to a dental office now, Elise said. They might make excellent lo mein. Elise laughed and tossed the menu. By noon, the counters were visible. Sunlight fell across the old yellow tile, making the kitchen look larger and sadder. Celia packed George's binoculars only after Ruth touched them and said yes. Daniel found a bottle of Worcestershire sauce that had expired 9 years earlier. That's vintage, Ruth said. That's biological warfare. They ate sandwiches on the porch steps. For 20 minutes, the 3 of them were almost easy together. Daniel told a story about a customer who ordered steak tartare and sent it back because it was raw. Elise imitated the customer's offended whisper. Ruth laughed hard enough to spill tea on her sleeve. Then Daniel stood and said, We should tackle the equipment barn. We? It's on the photography route. Meredith hasn't scheduled photography. She will. Ruth followed them down the drive. Celia stayed behind with the kitchen boxes, suddenly fascinated by tape. The equipment barn held pruning tools, tractor parts, irrigation fittings, empty chemical containers awaiting proper disposal, and 3 generations of objects that might someday fit something. Against the rear wall were shallow wooden bins filled with labels, bundles of grafting tape, and folded maps. The bins were empty. Ruth stopped. What happened to the contents? Daniel looked over from a stack of rusted rims. What contents? The bins? There was junk in those. Old tags, brittle tape, scraps of wire. Where is it? He pointed outside. A rented disposal trailer stood beyond the barn, half filled with rotted boards, broken pallets, and torn fertilizer sacks. Ruth reached it before he did. She leaned over the metal side. Hundreds of white plastic tags lay scattered beneath a length of guttering. Some were tied with faded blue thread. Others carried dates, row numbers, and variety names in George's cramped pencil or Ruth's black marker. A black bag had split open, spilling more beneath the heavier debris. What did you do? Daniel came up behind her. Those were garbage. Those were grafting records. They were loose tags in dusty bins. They matched trees in the upper blocks. You have maps, some maps. The tags record what took and what failed. We can get them out. Ruth looked into the trailer. Rainwater from the previous night pooled beneath the pallets. Ink bled across several labels. You put broken lumber on top of them. I didn't know. You didn't ask. You weren't here. I live here. You were in the house with Elise. You could have walked 100 yards. Daniel's face flushed. I am trying to help. No, you're trying to make the place look empty. That's what selling requires. Listening to offers does not require erasing every sign that someone has lived here. It requires presenting the property as something other people can imagine owning. I can imagine them owning it without you throwing away my work. Your work? Daniel gave a short, disbelieving laugh. Mom, half that stuff probably hasn't been touched since Dad was alive. Ruth gripped the trailer's edge. He saw too late that he had made it worse. I didn't mean, you never know what you mean until after you say it. That's not fair. Go home, Daniel. We can sort it. I said, go home. Elise had stopped at the barn door, arms folded tightly. He made a mistake. He made a decision. Because every decision here waits for you. Every nail, every box, every dead appliance. Nobody can move anything without stepping on a memory. Ruth turned toward her. Is that what you think? Elise's chin lifted, but her eyes shone. I think this family has spent 40 years asking the orchard for permission. The words struck with enough accuracy to sting. Daniel said, Elise, don't. No, you wanted honesty. She gestured at the trees, the buildings, the whole worn landscape. We missed dinners because of frost. We left holidays early because a truck was coming. Dad missed Daniel's graduation because peaches got hailed on. And now we're supposed to treat ruined tags like holy objects because they prove the orchard needed you again. Ruth could think of no answer that would not become another wound. Celia appeared halfway down the drive, then stopped when she saw them. Daniel picked up his jacket from the barn rail. We'll come back another day. No, Ruth said. He waited, but she gave him nothing else. After the van disappeared, Ruth climbed into the disposal trailer with Nora's rubber gloves and Calvin's help. They lifted out boards one at a time. Calvin said nothing about her hip. He simply stood close enough to steady her if necessary, without insulting her by offering. Nora spread the recovered tags across the packing tables. Some could be red. Others had become white strips stained with gray water. Near dusk, Ruth found one in George's handwriting. Upper 6, Mother Tree, Good Keeper. She pressed it flat beneath a jar. The office telephone rang. Meredith's voice was apologetic. I know it's late. I have 2 inquiries already. One is the development group we discussed. Ruth stared at the rows of wet tags. And the other? A small cider company. They asked specifically whether your old variety blocks are still producing. Ruth looked toward Nora, who was trying to piece together 2 halves of a label. What did you tell them? That they'd have to ask you. Set up both, Ruth said. Nora looked over. Meredith hesitated. On the same day? No. I don't want the developer watching the cider people count trees. And I don't want the cider people watching the developer count houses. That can be arranged. The orchard is packing Monday and Wednesday mornings. Not then. I'll send you some times. Ruth hung up and remained beside the telephone. Nora held up a softened tag with both hands. Cider Company, Vale Cider Works. I've seen their bottles, black label, little gold tree. I don't buy cider. You make it by accident in the bottom of your refrigerator. That is not branded. Calvin lowered another broken pallet out of the trailer. They buying apples or land? Meredith said, property. Nora's expression shifted. A company that wanted fruit might preserve jobs. A company that wanted property could still remove everyone who came with it. Ruth returned to sorting. We don't know what they want. By morning, Vale Cider Works had emailed a list of questions long enough to qualify as a courtship. They wanted harvest dates, annual yields from the upper hill, spray records, storage methods, pollinizer varieties, and any information Ruth had on the oldest pippin rows. They also asked whether she would send 2 sample boxes at their expense. Daniel, copied by Meredith, replied within 9 minutes. We would be happy to provide a complete production package. Ruth called him. What production package? I can assemble the numbers. They asked for apples. They asked for records. Records Nora keeps. I have the financial side. They did not ask how much the apples paid in property tax. Daniel went quiet. In the background, Ruth heard metal strike metal and a man call for more clean towels. He was at Ash Oak. I'm trying to make this easy, he said. For whom? For everybody. These people need to know they're dealing with an organized operation. They are. It is organized by the people operating it. Mom, can we not spend the next month fighting over every email? We can stop now. Don't answer questions directed to me. He released a long breath. Fine. This fine lasted longer than the one about the geraniums. Almost an hour. Nora selected the fruit herself. She rejected apples for shallow stem bowls, uneven color, and one tiny puncture Ruth could not see until Nora held it beneath a lamp. "They're making cider," Ruth said, "not jewelry. They asked for our best. Our best has flavor. Our best can have flavor without looking like it rolled here from Roanoke." They packed wine saps in one box and Albemarle Pippins in another, each cushioned with plain molded trays. Ruth added a single sheet describing the blocks and picking dates. No brochure, no watercolor houses. When the shipping driver left, Nora said, "That felt like sending your photograph to a stranger. At least I didn't have to comb them." Elise came the following afternoon, carrying a flat cardboard box. She placed it on the packing table without greeting anyone. Inside were the grafting tags she and Daniel had managed to retrieve before the disposal trailer was emptied. Most were dry. Elise had separated them between sheets of paper towel and weighted them flat. "I looked up conservation methods," she said. Nora examined the top layer. "These aren't historical documents. I didn't know what else to call them. Tree labels." The internet was less interested in those. Ruth stood across the table from her daughter. "Thank you." Elise nodded, still looking at the box. "Daniel said you told him not to come back. I told both of you. You looked at me when you said it. You rode in the same van. I told him to ask before cleaning the barn. And then I cleaned your kitchen." Ruth touched the corner of one paper towel. "You were right about some things." Elise looked up. "The takeout menus could go." "That's what you think I was right about? I'm working toward the rest." Elise's mouth tightened. For a moment, Ruth expected another argument. Instead, she took off her jacket and asked Nora where to put the salvage tags. They worked together for an hour. Elise copied legible writing into a spreadsheet, while Nora matched dates to orchard maps. Ruth supplied names where ink had run. A 1998 Arkansas Black had become ARKBL. But Ruth remembered the tree because George had grafted it the morning after they fought about buying a second-hand air blast sprayer. "You remember all of these?" Elise asked. "Not all. It seems like all. The ones attached to an argument are easier." Elise entered the row number. "No wonder your records are so thorough." The joke was small, but Ruth accepted it. When they finished, Elise followed her outside. Beside the packing house door leaned the old roadside sign, white paint grayed by weather, Mercer Orchard, hand-lettered in green. Ruth had taken it down in spring, intending to repaint it. The temporary sign at the road was plywood with the name stenciled in black. "I could redo that," Elise said. "It needs paint. It needs to be readable from a moving car. People should slow down. People don't." 3 days later, Elise returned with a new sign. It was dark green with cream lettering and a simple outline of an apple branch. Mercer Orchard ran across the center in clean, graceful type. Beneath it, smaller words read, "Est, 1978. Ruth disliked how much she liked it. "You kept the name," she said. "I'm not Daniel. That sounds temporary." Elise ignored her. "The sign maker can install it tomorrow. What's wrong with the old one?" "Termites, fading, and the fact that Dad painted the R backward, corrected it, then painted over the correction badly. He said it gave the sign character. It gave the sign 2 R's. Ruth ran her fingers across the smooth, raised lettering. "No Mercer Ridge, no Mercer Ridge." The new sign went up. The old one moved into the equipment barn, where Ruth could see its doubled R whenever she fetched pruning shears. She told herself she had preserved it for sentimental reasons, not because letting Elise improve something felt dangerously close to agreeing with her. The development representative arrived in a gray sport utility vehicle the next Thursday. His name was Graham Lowell, and he wore a quilted vest with a company logo so discreet Ruth assumed it was expensive. Meredith accompanied him. Daniel had brought printed maps. Elise had not come. Graham shook Ruth's hand, admired the house from the drive, then spent more time looking at slopes and culverts than at buildings. He asked practical questions: water rights, flood history, road frontage, neighboring parcels. Ruth answered what she knew, and said so when she did not. Daniel kept handing him plans. At the upper hill, Graham studied the view without mentioning apples. "We'd probably keep 2 rows along the entrance," he said. "Mature trees photograph well." Ruth looked at the nearest wine sap. Its trunk divided low, one side propped with a wooden brace George had cut from locust. "They also bear fruit," she said. "Of course." He said it pleasantly, as if fruit were a charming secondary trait. Back at the kitchen table, Graham outlined the process. surveys, soil testing, county review, an extended examination period. The possible price was near the range Meredith had mentioned, but not all of it would arrive at once. The company could withdraw under several conditions. If approvals were delayed, Ruth might spend more than a year maintaining an orchard everyone knew was likely to disappear. Daniel asked intelligent questions. He had researched contingencies, tax timing, access road requirements. Ruth listened as he moved through the discussion with confidence she rarely saw at family dinners. For a few minutes, she understood why he had pushed so hard. He was good at imagining the next version of things: restaurants, property, a family life, without leaking roofs. He did not see old trees, he saw trapped value. After Graham and Meredith left, Daniel remained at the table gathering his maps. "He's serious," he said. "He hasn't made an offer. He will. You sound certain. He drove 2 hours. So do people who sell vacuum cleaners." Daniel stacked the pages harder than necessary. "The cider company can't touch that number. We haven't heard their number. They have 12 employees and a tasting room. Graham's group built 4 communities last year. You researched them too." "Yes. Somebody has to." Ruth noticed the dark half-moons beneath his eyes. His shirt collar was frayed where a jacket usually covered it. "How is the restaurant?" The change in his face was nearly invisible. "Fine. That word runs in the family. We're in a slow patch. It was empty last Thursday afternoon. We don't open until 5. I heard pans and staff. Prep. And today, I have a manager." "Who?" Daniel slid the maps into his leather portfolio. "Why are we discussing my restaurant?" "Because you're discussing my orchard as if your life depends on it." His hand stopped on the zipper. Ruth waited. "I used the first restaurant sale to open Ash Oak," he said. "You know that." "I know what you told us. I took on more debt than I planned." "How much more?" "It's handled." "By whom?" His eyes hardened. "This is why I didn't tell you. Because I ask numbers? Because you hear trouble and reach for your checkbook. Then 5 years later, you look at me like I stole roof shingles." The words landed close to something Ruth had not admitted even to herself. "I never said the roof was your fault. You didn't have to." Daniel zipped the portfolio. "I'm not asking you to save my restaurant. I'm asking you to consider that selling could give all of us room to breathe. All of us again. Yes, all of us. You didn't build this place alone. No, we paid for it too. Maybe not with checks, but we paid." He left before Ruth could answer. That evening, Meredith called. The samples had reached Vale Cider Works. The owners wanted to visit and had requested the last appointment of the day, so they could see the packing operation without interrupting it. "They're husband and wife," Meredith said. "Paul and Maren Vale. They'd like to have dinner afterward if that isn't an imposition." Ruth thought of Daniel's restaurant, his frayed collar, his careful refusal to name the size of his trouble. "It's an imposition," she said, "but tell them yes." Daniel took over the menu before Meredith finished confirming the date. He wanted to cook at the farmhouse because serving the Vale's food from Ash Oak would, in his words, demonstrate the family's combined strengths. Elise offered to set the table and bring flowers. When Ruth said she could roast a chicken, both children spoke at once. "Let us handle it." The following week, Daniel stood in her kitchen checking the oven and said, too casually, "It may be better if you rest before they arrive." Ruth looked at him. He busied himself with a bundle of rosemary. "You want me out of my own kitchen?" "Only during the property tour," he said. "We need to present a clear vision." "A clear vision of what?" Daniel stripped rosemary leaves from a stem. "A professionally managed agricultural property." "You mean an orchard?" "I mean something the Vales can see themselves taking forward." "And the sight of me interferes with that?" "No, you know it doesn't." "Then explain it better." He dropped the bare stem into the sink. When buyers tour a family business, they need one person guiding the conversation. If all 3 of us answer every question, we'll sound divided. We are divided, which is why we don't need to advertise it. Ruth watched him chop the rosemary. The knife moved quickly, rocking beneath his palm. Whatever else Daniel had become, he was graceful in a kitchen. "Who is the one person?" she asked. "I thought I'd lead the tour. You can join us for dinner." "You thought?" "I know how buyers think. You know how restaurant customers think. I run a business, so do I." Daniel set down the knife. "Mom, please. I'm trying to give this offer a chance. You don't know what they're offering, neither do you. Then perhaps the people who asked about my trees should see me standing among them." He rubbed his forehead. Why does everything have to become a test of whether we respect you? Because you keep handing me the test. Elise arrived with flowers and found them facing each other across the kitchen island. She put the vase down slowly. What happened? I'm obstructing the clear vision, Ruth said. Daniel turned back to the cutting board. I asked her to let me handle the tour. Elise took a moment. That might be simpler. Ruth looked at her. Not because you shouldn't be there, Elise added. Because Daniel has prepared a presentation of my orchard, of the options. Ruth went to the refrigerator and opened it, though she needed nothing. Inside were trays of wine saps, 2 jars of mustard, leftover beans, and a jug of cider Nora had insisted was still good. She closed the door. Fine, she said. Daniel looked up. Fine? You lead the tour. Suspicion replaced relief almost immediately. He knew her word fine as well as she knew his. But if they ask me a question, I answer it. Of course. And you don't tell the workers to redirect anyone. I haven't. You asked Calvin for production information. That was before. There is always a before with you. Elise stepped between them and pushed the vase toward Ruth. Do these look all right? The arrangement held white chrysanthemums, red dahlias, and 3 branches with tiny crab apples. It was lovely, restrained, and entirely wrong for the middle of a working table. They look expensive, Ruth said. They were. That wasn't praise. I accepted it anyway. The visit was scheduled for 6 the following Friday. By noon, Daniel had occupied the kitchen. He brought 2 coolers, a box of knives, and 6 folded dish towels from the restaurant. The menu grew every time Ruth asked about it. Rosemary chicken, cider pan sauce, whipped parsnips, roasted carrots, a bitter green salad with apples, and a tart Daniel had made at Ash Oak. You know they work with apples, Ruth said. They may have eaten one before. The menu should connect to the property. If they buy it, do they also get the parsnips? Daniel pointed his knife at the door. Tour. Ruth left him to it. The packing line was running behind. A wholesale customer had added 40 boxes to an order that morning, and one of the seasonal workers had called in and sick. Ruth spent 2 hours checking weights and replacing torn tray liners, while Nora argued with a printer that insisted the Mercer Orchard label was an invalid paper size. At 4:30, Calvin reported that the south pump was cycling too often. Valve? Ruth asked. Maybe a leak. They drove out together. A coupling had loosened beneath the soil, turning the grass around it dark and spongy. Calvin shut down the line. Ruth held the flashlight while he cleared mud from the fitting. Her boots sank past the ankles. At least you'll look authentic, Calvin said. My children prefer aspirational. Don't know what that means. Neither do they. They finished at 5:30. Ruth washed her hands and face in the packing house restroom, but the mud had dried along her boot seams and splattered the knees of her work pants. When she reached the house, Elise stood in the bedroom holding Ruth's blue blouse on a hanger. Shower, Elise said. No time. You smell like irrigation ditch. That's because I was in one. Elise glanced at the clock. Put this on at least. Ruth pulled the blouse over her work shirt and buttoned it. The collar beneath made the neckline sit unevenly. You can see the shirt. They know it's a farm. Elise. What? Say what you mean. Her daughter dropped her hands. I want tonight to go well. So do I. No, you want them to recognize what you built. Daniel wants them to recognize what it could become. I want us to survive dinner without somebody using the word inheritance. Ruth adjusted the blouse. That sounds fair. Elise looked down at the boots. Do you own another pair? Several. Clean ones? Not currently. They heard Daniel call that the sauce had broken. Elise closed her eyes. Stay here. Ruth followed her downstairs. The sauce had not broken. It had thickened too quickly. Daniel was whisking butter into it with the grim attention of a surgeon while the chicken sat on the counter. That should be in the oven, Ruth said. It needs 12 more minutes before they arrive. The Vales are touring first. Daniel stopped whisking. Ruth looked at the uncooked chicken, then at him. You timed dinner for 6? I thought cocktails, brief tour, dinner at 7. Then the chicken goes in at 6:30. It needs to rest. It will rest until morning if you leave it there. Daniel muttered something and opened the oven. Ruth put the pan inside. Go sit down, he told her. I'm preventing food poisoning. I know how to roast chicken, apparently on a conceptual level. Elise came in carrying place cards. Ruth stared. Do we not know who we are? They balanced the table. There are 6 people. Exactly. The doorbell did not ring because it had stopped working the previous winter. Instead, Tires crunched in the drive. Elise looked at the clock. They're early. 5 minutes, Daniel said. Who arrives 5 minutes early? People with watches. He tore off his apron and checked his shirt. Elise picked up the flowers, moved them 2 inches, then moved them back. Mom, she said, maybe stay in the kitchen until the tour is finished. Daniel was already heading outside. It'll be easier. The screen door slapped shut behind them. Ruth stood beside the oven, with her hands hanging at her sides. Through the window, she saw the dark blue station wagon parked behind Meredith's sedan. A tall man with sandy gray hair stepped out on the driver's side. The woman beside him wore red glasses and a green wool coat. Paul and Marin Vale. Ruth could walk outside. The orchard was hers. The agreement said she would approve every visit, and she had. Nothing required her to hide behind a roasting pan. Yet, if she went now, Daniel would say she had agreed, and then undermined him. Elise would give her that disappointed look, the one that made Ruth feel both 80 years old and 8. She turned to the oven. Daniel's voice carried through the screen, warm and assured. We thought we'd begin with the upper hill. It gives the best sense of the property, Marin said. I'm sorry. Where's Ruth Mercer? Ruth's hand stopped on the oven mitt. My mother's resting, Daniel answered. At 6 o'clock, there was a pause. Paul spoke next. We came to meet Mrs. Mercer. We're not walking the orchard without her. The kitchen seemed to change size around Ruth. She opened the screen door. 5 faces turned toward her. Meredith's expression revealed nothing, but her eyes flicked once toward Daniel. Marin smiled first. Ruth, that depends, Ruth said. Are you selling anything? Marin laughed. Not tonight. Then yes. Paul crossed the drive and offered his hand. He had a broad, weathered face and fingernails cut close. Paul Vale. Thank you for having us. Marin, his wife said, shaking Ruth's hand next. We've been looking forward to this. Daniel stepped nearer. Mom decided to join us. Ruth looked at him. I heard my name. We were just explaining the tour. Marin glanced at Ruth's muddy boots. You have irrigation trouble? A loose coupling in the south line? Galvanized or PVC? PVC now. Galvanized until 6 years ago. Did you replace the whole line? Only the lower section. We should have done all of it, but it was a thin year. Marin nodded as if Ruth had answered a question larger than the pipe. Daniel lifted his folder. If we head up now, we can catch the view before sunset. Paul did not move. Could we start in the packing house? Of course, Ruth said. She led them. Daniel walked beside Meredith, speaking quietly enough that Ruth could not hear. Elise followed with a smile fixed in place. In the packing house, Nora was finishing the late order. Marin went straight to the open cartons. Wine saps? From the center slope, Ruth said. Upper fruit runs smaller and stronger. Usually, less water, more stress. Paul asked about the grading line. Marin asked Nora how much fruit was hand-sorted. Nora answered with precision and no decoration. When Daniel began describing modernization possibilities, Paul listened politely, then asked Ruth how many days she could hold pippins before pressing. Depends when they're picked, she said, assuming late October. 6 weeks in north storage if the compressor behaves. Longer in south, but you lose brightness. You've pressed them for fresh cider, not hard cider. What do they taste like after storage? Sharp, floral, less green than they smell. Marin looked at Paul. Something passed between them. They drove up in 2 vehicles. Ruth took the Vales in her truck. Daniel started toward the passenger door, but Marin was already climbing in. At the upper hill, Ruth showed them the pippins first. Marin examined leaves, fruit spurs, and the ground beneath the trees. Paul asked how many had been replanted on newer rootstock. Ruth showed him the rows where the old roots still held. Daniel tried twice to discuss home sites. Neither Vale interrupted him. Neither asked a follow-up question. At dinner, the rosemary chicken was slightly dry and the pan sauce excellent. Daniel spoke about ash oak, local sourcing, and the opportunity to build tasting events around the orchard. Elise described her ideas for restoring the farmhouse without stripping away its character. Paul complimented the meal. Then Marin turned to Ruth. Who taught you to graft? My father. George improved my technique by criticizing it. Did you choose the old varieties? Most of them. Why keep them when the wholesale market shifted? Because pulling out a healthy tree to chase a price is an expensive kind of panic. Daniel set down his fork. Question followed question. Labor, frost pockets, neighboring growers, harvest timing. Every answer drew the next question toward Ruth. She tried once to bring Daniel in by mentioning his relationships with restaurant buyers. Paul asked Daniel about volume, thanked him, and returned to Ruth's thinning methods. Elise grew quieter. Dessert arrived untouched for several minutes. Finally, Daniel said, "It might help if we understood your vision for the property." Paul looked at Marin. "We don't have one yet," she said. "We have a question." Daniel leaned forward. Marin kept her eyes on Ruth. "If you sold," she asked, "would you stay long enough to teach someone how this orchard actually works?" Ruth looked down at her tart. Daniel's place card rested above his fork, though no one had needed help finding him. The room smelled of browned butter, apples, and the rosemary branch Elise had tucked beside each napkin. "How long?" Ruth asked. Marin did not rush to fill the silence. 3 growing seasons would be ideal, not full-time, more during pruning, bloom, thinning, and harvest, less in winter. "As an employee, as a paid advisor," Paul said, "with defined hours and authority over the transition areas. We'd work out the details if we reach that point." Daniel leaned back. "My mother has been trying to reduce her workload." Ruth turned to him. "Have I?" "That's what this process is about. This process appears to mean different things to everybody." Elise cut the tip from her tart and did not eat it. Marin folded her hands on the table. "We don't want to put you in the middle of a family disagreement." "You arrived in the middle," Ruth said. "It would be rude not to sit down." Paul smiled, but Daniel's face stayed tight. "What exactly would you be buying?" Ruth asked. "The land, the operating business, the storage and packing facilities," Paul said. "We'd keep the orchard in production. Some blocks would be replanted over time. Some might come out." "Which ones?" "We're not qualified to answer that yet." Daniel's gaze moved sharply toward Paul. It was the first answer all evening that seemed to please him. Marin continued. "Our goal isn't to preserve every tree because it's old. We need fruit that produces. But we're interested in the varieties you've kept, especially the wine saps and pippins. We'd expand pressing here, possibly bring in fruit from nearby growers, and use the packing house for both fresh orders and cider production." "Nora runs the packing house," Ruth said. "We noticed. And Calvin runs field crews." "We'd want to speak to both of them, with your permission," Daniel said. "There are broader staffing questions that would need to be evaluated." Paul looked at him. Naturally, the word was courteous. Ruth heard the boundary beneath it. "Why me?" she asked. Marin glanced toward the window, though darkness had turned it into a mirror. "Because orchards look simple from a distance. Rows, harvest, repeat. They aren't. The trial tags tell us you've been making small decisions for decades. Which rootstock tolerates that wet block? Which tree gets another year? Which buyer takes smaller fruit without punishing you for it? We can hire someone with a horticulture degree. We can't hire your memory." Daniel's fork clicked against his plate. Ruth thought of the wet tags spread across the packing tables, their ink bleeding into paper towels. "Memory makes mistakes," she said. "So do spreadsheets," Paul answered. Marin added, "And to be clear, we're protecting ourselves. If you leave the day after closing, we inherit a complicated operation without the person who understands its habits. We wouldn't make an offer under those conditions." Elise finally looked up. "So, you're not interested in the orchard unless my mother agrees to keep working." "We're interested in an orderly transition," Marin said. She broke her hip. 3 years ago," Ruth said. 2.5, I was there for it." Elise put down her fork. "I'm aware." Marin's expression softened. "The role would not include physical labor." "There is no role in agriculture that includes no physical labor," Ruth said. "Someone always ends up carrying a box." "Then the contract should say how heavy the box can be," Paul said. Ruth laughed before she could stop herself. Daniel pushed his dessert plate away. "I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. We haven't discussed valuation." "No," Paul said. "We'd need more information first. We provided financial statements. They're useful. We also need block-level yields, equipment condition, capital requirements, and labor costs tied to the proposed operation. I can prepare those." "Nora and I can," Ruth said. Daniel looked at her. "You asked me to help. I asked you to let me hear offers. And here we are, hearing one that requires you to remain chained to the place." The table went silent. Daniel seemed to hear his own phrasing too late. Ruth laid her napkin beside her plate. "No one has chained me to anything. I didn't mean literally, thank you. That was my concern. He stood and began collecting dishes. Paul rose to help, but Daniel told him sharply to leave them. The evening recovered enough to end politely. Paul praised the sauce. Marin asked if she could take one of the pippins from the bowl on the sideboard. Elise wrapped slices of tart in waxed paper for the veils, though they protested. At the door, Marin held Ruth's hand a second longer than manners required. You don't need to answer tonight, she said. I couldn't if I wanted to. Good. Daniel stood behind them, with the posture of a host waiting for a table to turn over. After the station wagon and Meredith's sedan vanished down the drive, Elise closed the front door. Well, she said. Daniel carried 2 wine glasses into the kitchen. That was a waste of time. They came 2 hours, Ruth said, to interview you for a job, to understand the orchard. They asked only for you. Elise's voice made the sentence sound less like admiration than an accusation. Ruth turned. What was I supposed to do, pretend not to know the answers? You could have let Daniel finish one. He finished several. About food. He owns a restaurant. Daniel put the glasses into the sink too hard. You enjoyed it. What? The whole thing? Them looking past us? Them proving you're the only person in the family who matters here? Ruth stared at him. He leaned against the counter, the evening's confidence gone from his face. You sat there and let them treat Elise like a decorator and me like hired catering. They asked questions about the business they might buy. I gave them the financials. I prepared the property maps. Elise fixed the house. I cooked dinner, and they thanked you. That isn't the point. Then what is? The point is they were flattering you because they want the land cheap. The word cheap changed the room. Ruth crossed her arms. You haven't seen a number. I know they can't match Graham. Neither can most people. Exactly. So they make you feel indispensable. They offer you a little consulting title and count on you choosing that over money. Elise moved the flowers away from the edge of the table. He's not completely wrong. Ruth looked at her daughter. I liked them, Elise said. I did. But they came prepared. They knew exactly what would appeal to you. You think being asked a direct question is all it takes? No. I think you've been alone for 3 years, and 2 strangers arrived acting fascinated by everything we've been telling you to leave behind. The cruelty of it lay in how gently Elise said it. Ruth looked toward George's chair. No one had sat there during dinner. Paul had taken the place to Ruth's right, Marin opposite him. The empty chair remained untouched at the end. You may both go, Ruth said. Daniel laughed once without humor. There it is. Yes, there it is. We say one thing you don't like, and the conversation ends. No, you came into my house, asked me to hide while buyers toured my land, then accused me of being seduced because those buyers wanted to hear me speak. The conversation has had a full evening. Elise picked up her purse. The flowers need water tomorrow. I can manage. I know you can manage. Do you? Elise's face tightened, but she left without answering. Daniel stayed to cover the chicken and put away the knives. Ruth wanted him gone. She also could not bear the thought of waking to his expensive knives on her counter as if he had fled in emergency. At the back door, he said, If the Vales offer half what the developer does, will any of this matter? Yes. To whom? To me. He shook his head. You always said the orchard was for the family. It was. Past tense? Ruth did not answer. The next morning, the kitchen looked offensively beautiful. Clean counters, flowers and fresh water, tart crumbs beneath the glass cake stand. Ruth made coffee and took it to the porch. Fog sat low between the tree rows. Calvin's truck arrived at 6:40. Nora came 8 minutes later, headlights sweeping across the new sign. The packing house doors opened. Lights came on one section at a time. The place started without Ruth. She had always known it could. Seeing it happen felt different. At 7:15, she went down anyway. Nora was checking box labels. She took one look at Ruth and said, How bad was dinner? Daniel's chicken was dry, so severe. The Vales want me to stay 3 years if they buy. Nora stopped stacking labels. Doing what? Teaching them the orchard. You considering it? I'm considering whether considering it is evidence of loneliness. Nora's face did not change. That sounds like Elise. It was. Elise thinks a clean countertop can cure grief. She isn't always wrong. No. That's what makes her tiring. Calvin came in carrying a broken belt from the grading line. Need to order 2 of these. We have one in storage, Ruth said. Used it in August. The supplier in Staunton keeps them. Stop stocking that width. Ruth nearly told him who to call next. Then she caught herself. What would you do if I weren't here? Measure it and find one online. Do that. Calvin examined her. You sick? I'm experimenting. With what? Absence. She left before either of them could object. For the first time in years, Ruth drove into town on a harvest morning without a parts list. She sat in a diner booth and ordered eggs she did not want. Around her, people discussed roadwork, football, and a church roof fund. No one asked about storage temperatures. She walked through a home goods store and discovered an entire aisle of signs telling visitors to gather, laugh, and love. She bought socks. By 10:30, she was back in her truck, taking the long way home. The orchard had not called. That was the success of the experiment and the part she disliked most. At the packing house, the replacement belt dimensions were written on the whiteboard. An online order confirmation sat on Nora's desk. Calvin had solved it. Ruth stood in the doorway until Nora noticed her. That was quick, Nora said. I got socks. Productive. Ruth looked at the smooth-running line. Tomorrow I'm taking the morning off again. Nora's eyebrows lifted. Ruth went into the office and called Daniel. When he answered, she said, You want me to believe the orchard can run differently? There was a cautious pause. Yes. Then come Monday at 6. For what? You're running it until noon. Daniel said nothing. Ruth looked through the dusty window at the moving belts, the turning apples, and Nora waiting to hear what trouble she had just invited. At noon, Ruth said, We'll see what you know. 6, Daniel said. Orchards keep mornings. Ash Oak closes at 11 on Sundays. Then you'll be tired. That hardly seems like a useful test. Being tired is half of agriculture. He arrived Monday at 5:53 carrying a travel mug and a legal pad. Ruth was waiting outside the packing house in the dark. She had already unlocked the office but had not switched on the grading line. Daniel wore an old canvas coat Ruth remembered buying him for college. The sleeves were too short now. His boots were still cleaner than Calvin's, but at least they were not decorative. What are the rules? He asked. You're in charge until noon. Completely? No selling land? No firing Nora. Anything else? Calvin has the field schedule. Nora has the packing schedule. 2 pickups are due before 10. The restaurant order sheets are on the desk. If Amos calls, answer. Why would Amos call? He enjoys suspense. Daniel opened his legal pad. What are you doing? Not being here. Where? That defeats the purpose. Nora came through the door, saw Daniel, and stopped. You knew, he said. I hoped Ruth would recover. Calvin arrived behind her and checked his watch. 7 minutes early. There goes my bet. Ruth handed Daniel the office keys. He looked at them in his palm. You trust me? I trust Nora and Calvin to prevent structural damage. I'm serious. So am I. She left before sunrise, driving east with no destination settled. The darkness thinned over the fields. At an intersection where she normally turned toward the farm supply store, she continued straight. A sign advertised an overlook 6 miles ahead. Ruth had passed it for 30 years without stopping, because 6 miles out and 6 miles back was half an hour, and half an hour always belonged to something else. The overlook was a gravel pullout above a river valley. One picnic table leaned downhill. A metal trash can wore a lid chained to its handle, though someone had still managed to leave a coffee cup on the ground beside it. Ruth sat in the truck with the heater running. George would have complained that the view was blocked by scrub pine. Then he would have stayed 40 minutes. She had brought no book, no breakfast, and no purpose. Without a task, the morning widened in an uncomfortable way. She watched fog lift from the river. 2 crows argued over something in the ditch. Her phone remained on the passenger seat. At 7:20, it lit with Nora's name. Ruth stared until the ringing stopped. A minute later, a message appeared. Call when your experiment permits. Ruth did not call. She turned the phone face down. At the orchard, Daniel began well. Ruth learned this afterward because Nora believed failures should be documented accurately. The first pickup arrived 20 minutes early. Daniel found the correct order, noticed the driver had been sent with space for only half the load, and rearranged the second pickup so neither truck sat idle. He added a fuel surcharge to a restaurant account that had been receiving free delivery for 3 years. He also cleaned the office coffee maker. The coffee tastes worse now, Nora later said, but the inside is less frightening. At 7:20, the label printer rejected an entire batch. Daniel unplugged it, restarted the software, and got it working without striking it once. That was when Nora called Ruth, not because of a crisis, but because the success disturbed her. By 8, Daniel had moved from competent to ambitious. A wholesale buyer named Chesapeake Pantry telephoned looking for late-season fruit for a regional promotion. Ruth had spoken to them the previous year, but they wanted uniform color and more volume than she could promise in a single week. Daniel heard a new account. He offered a sample shipment of pippins and wine saps by Wednesday. Nora told him the pippins were not ready. "Some are," Daniel said. "Some isn't in order. We need 40 boxes. We'll have 40 next week. Their promotion starts Friday. Then they should have called last week." Daniel went to the upper hill with Calvin. The block did, in fact, hold enough mature fruit for 40 boxes if selected carefully over several rows. Calvin explained that a picking crew could color pick, taking only ready apples, but it would be slower and more expensive. Daniel looked at the labor sheet, the waiting truck, and a customer who might become valuable. "Pick rows 6 through 9, he said. "Whole rows?" Calvin asked. "We'll sort them below. Fruit isn't there yet. Enough is different from all." Daniel repeated the instruction. At 9:30, Ruth drove into a town she barely knew and parked outside a bakery. She chose it because the sign did not include the word farm, orchard, harvest, country, local, or heritage. The woman behind the counter had magenta hair and recommended an almond pastry. Ruth ordered it, then added a second coffee despite already feeling slightly unsteady from the first. She sat beside a window. Everyone else seemed to know how to occupy a morning. A man in work clothes read a newspaper. 2 women shared photographs on a phone. A gray-haired couple divided a cinnamon roll precisely in half without speaking. Ruth tried not to look at the clock. At 10:15, she turned her phone over. No missed calls beyond Nora's. 3 messages waited. "Nora, he cleaned the coffee pot. This may be revenge." "Calvin, call me when you're back." "Daniel, everything under control." The last one should have reassured her. Instead, she heard George saying the same words while standing beside a tractor with smoke coming from beneath the hood. She typed, "I'll be there at noon," and put the phone away. The almond pastry was excellent. She bought another for Nora, a cinnamon twist for Calvin, and, after some thought, a plain croissant for Daniel. He disliked almonds and raisins, and she could not remember whether cinnamon gave him heartburn. At 11:45, she turned beneath Elise's new sign. A flatbed truck was leaving the loading area with the second scheduled order. The driver waved. Nothing was on fire. Then Ruth saw the field bins. 6 stood beneath the packing house awning, filled with pale green pippins. Several had been piled above the wooden rims. The top layer showed stem punctures where one apple's stem had pressed into another. A bruise darkened beneath the skin of one near the corner. Ruth parked. Nora came out before the truck door shut. No one died. "Comforting," I told him. "Where is he?" "On the line." Inside, Daniel stood beside the grading belt, examining fruit as it passed. He had taken off the canvas coat and rolled his sleeves twice, neatly. 2 workers sorted undersized apples into a juice bin. When he saw Ruth, his face opened with tired pride. "We secured a new wholesale trial. So I see. 40 boxes. If it goes well, they're talking about a standing seasonal order." Ruth picked up a pippin. The ground color was still too green. She cut it with the small knife Nora kept beside the scale. The seeds were pale brown, not dark. The flesh resisted the blade. This one needed a week. Daniel took half from her. "It tastes fine. It tastes like a hedge. It has acidity. It has ambition." Nora made a sound that might have been a cough. Daniel set the apple down. "The mature fruit will balance the less mature fruit. They asked for fresh boxes, not a blend. We can sort." That was not the picking instruction. The crew had 4 rows. We needed volume. Ruth walked to the awning. Daniel followed. She lifted one of the top apples and pressed her thumb near the stem. A soft crescent remained. These bins were overfilled. Only the last 2. 3. The truck was waiting. The truck was not here for this order. I know. I used the available crew before they moved to the creek block. Ruth turned the fruit in her hand. 40 boxes was not ruin. Much of it could be held, grated, or pressed. The bruised apples would go to cider. The mistake had a cost, not a tragedy. That almost made her angrier. Daniel would point to the absence of disaster as proof that judgment did not matter. Calvin came around the corner carrying a picking bag. His expression said he preferred hail. I told him to color pick. he said. You told me it would take twice as long, Daniel replied. It does. And Ruth told me I was in charge. Nora crossed her arms. Ruth also told you Calvin had the field schedule. What was the point of putting me in charge if every decision had already been made? To see what you'd do with advice, Ruth said. Daniel looked at her. So, this was a trap. No. You left people waiting to report my mistakes. I left experienced people here to keep you from making expensive ones. That sounds like a trap. Ruth handed him the cut apple. You got the label printer running. You rearranged the pickups. Nora says you corrected a delivery charge we've been missing. Daniel glanced at Nora. She shrugged. I document accurately. You did useful work, Ruth continued. Then a new customer made you feel pressed, and you chose speed over the person telling you the fruit wasn't ready. I chose an opportunity. You chose an answer you already liked. His face closed. Ruth heard the resemblance between her words and everything her children had said about her refusing to sell. She disliked it enough to soften her voice. That doesn't make you stupid, Daniel. It makes you new at this. He looked toward the bins. You think I don't understand anything because I left. I think you understand numbers. You understand customers. You understand how to make people want what you're serving. Those things matter, but not enough. Not by themselves. He picked up a bruised pippin and rubbed the skin with his thumb. What happens to these? Some hold for next week. Some go to juice. We delay the sample shipment until Friday and send less. You call Chesapeake Pantry and tell them the crop determines the date, not their promotion. They'll go somewhere else? Maybe. You're comfortable with that? No, I'm experienced with it. Daniel stared at the apple a moment longer, then took his phone from his pocket and walked toward the office. Nora watched him go. You gave him a pastry? Ruth held out the bag. Which one is mine? Almond, then I forgive you for the morning. Calvin took the cinnamon twist and examined it. What are we forgiving? Nothing yet. Daniel remained in the office for 20 minutes. When he came out, he had secured a Friday delivery and reduced the order to 30 boxes. He also made every worker stop piling bins above the rim. He ate the croissant standing beside the loading dock. At noon, he returned the keys to Ruth. Well, she asked, the orchard can run without you. It did. That isn't what you wanted me to say. I didn't ask for a particular answer. He glanced toward Nora and Calvin. It can't run without them. No, and it can't run if nobody changes anything. Ruth looked at the bruised fruit. Also no. His shoulders lowered slightly. For the first time in weeks, they were not arguing from opposite ends of an imaginary sale. Meredith's sedan appeared beneath the new sign. She parked and came toward them, carrying 2 sealed envelopes and a thin folder. I was going to call, she said, but both groups moved faster than I expected. Daniel looked at the envelopes. Meredith handed the first to Ruth. Graham Lowell's company name was printed in the corner. The second bore a small gold tree. 2 proposals, Meredith said. Very different ones. Daniel reached for the envelope with the gold tree. Ruth placed her hand over both. You had 6 hours, she said. Your shift is over. Meredith's mouth twitched. Daniel did not appreciate it. They moved into the office. Nora brought a 3rd chair from the packing floor and stayed by the door until Ruth invited her to sit. Calvin leaned against the filing cabinet, eating the last of his cinnamon twist. This is family business, Daniel said. It is also their employment, Ruth answered. Meredith set the thin folder between them. Neither proposal is a final contract. Both depend on inspections, surveys, and negotiation. Today we're comparing intentions. She opened Graham Lowell's envelope first. The development group proposed $3,400,000 for all 42 acres, including the house, packing facilities, equipment, and water access. They would pay a deposit once a formal agreement was signed. The rest would come at closing, which could take 14 months and depended on road approval, soil tests, and the company's satisfaction with county review. Daniel leaned forward, 3.4. Before transaction costs and taxes, Meredith said. Still. Ruth followed the lines with her finger. The number looked unreal in print, too round and clean to have anything to do with the muddy bins outside. What happens during those 14 months, she asked. You operate as usual, Meredith said. The developer gets access for testing and planning. If they withdraw under an allowed contingency, you keep the agreed deposit but retain the property. Meaning, we could lose a selling season and end up here again. Nora said. Yes. Daniel turned. Or we could close for 3.4 million. Nora met his gaze. I heard the number the first time. Graham's proposal allowed Ruth 90 days in the farmhouse after closing. The equipment was included without separate valuation. The trees were described as existing agricultural improvements, which struck Ruth as a long phrase for something no one intended to keep. Meredith opened the second envelope. Intended, Nora said. Meredith nodded. Not guaranteed in the current language. Calvin asked. Health insurance? Not addressed. Then it doesn't exist yet. Ruth looked at him. He lifted one shoulder. The proposal included an annual payment tied to cider produced from designated Mercer varieties. It was not ownership in Vale Cider Works, Meredith explained, but a licensing and production arrangement that would keep Ruth's name connected to the fruit. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. They want the brand. They want the orchard name, Meredith said. Which is the brand? Yes. And they want Mom to help them build their business for almost 40% less. Ruth looked at the figures. The Vale's number was not small. It was more money than she had ever expected to possess, and less than the number now lodged behind everyone's eyes. Can they afford it? She asked. They included proof of financing capacity, Meredith said. They'd still need a lender's final approval. What happens to the trees? They attached a 5-year operating outline. Meredith passed Ruth several pages. The upper heirloom blocks remained. The center slope stayed in fresh production. 2 younger blocks would be replanted gradually with cider varieties. The Wet Creek block might become a filtration area for runoff rather than be replanted again. It was practical. That unsettled Ruth more than a sentimental promise would have. The Vales had noticed what the orchard was, including its failures. 20 hours becomes 40 easily, she said. That would need clear enforcement, Meredith replied. What authority would I have? The draft says advisory authority over variety selection, harvest standards, and transition training. Day-to-day ownership decisions would belong to the Vales. Ruth felt the shift inside that sentence. Her expertise would matter. Her final word would not. Daniel saw her hesitate. You'd be working for people on land you used to own. I understand employment. It isn't the same. No. The office heater clicked on, though no one had touched it. Warm air carried the old toast smell across the room. Calvin cleared his throat. They buying the broken sprayer? Equipment is included, Meredith said. That narrows the price gap. No one laughed except Ruth. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. He looked exhausted again. The morning had left dust on his sleeves and a pale scrape across one knuckle. The development offer changes everything, he said. For you, Ruth replied. For all of us. Nora stood. That's my cue. You can stay, Ruth said. No. Whatever you decide, I need to get 30 boxes of ambitious pippins ready by Friday. Calvin followed her out. At the door, he looked back at Ruth. Storm coming Thursday night. Don't let anybody schedule surveyors Friday morning. Then the office belonged to family again, with Meredith as its careful witness. Daniel tapped the Vale proposal. 2.1 for the productive land and business. They leave you the house because it's expensive to maintain and awkward for their operation. This isn't kindness. I didn't call it kindness. And a production payment based on their accounting, which can be negotiated. They saw exactly what you wanted to hear. Ruth closed the folder. You keep saying that as if wanting something disqualifies it. It does if it costs $1.3 million. The offers cover different property. You can buy another house. I have a house. A house attached to work that is going to kill you. Meredith gathered the loose pages into 2 piles. I think the useful next step is a separate review. No one needs to answer today. When do they need an answer? Daniel asked. The Vales requested a response within 2 weeks. Graham's group gave 21 days. Ruth nodded. Elise should see these. Daniel looked at the clock. She can come tonight. She can come when she's free. Mom, I am not holding a reading at my bedside. Daniel's chair scraped back. I have to get to the restaurant. Then go. He stood in the doorway. Please don't mistake the offer that makes you feel needed for the offer that respects what this place is worth. Ruth met his eyes. And you don't mistake the offer that saves you for the one that saves me. His face went still. Meredith looked down at the folder. Daniel left without answering. Elise arrived the following evening with a calculator, a legal pad, and no flowers. She read the development proposal first, then the Vale proposal twice. They'd put cider production in the packing house, she asked. Eventually, Trucks, tasting events, tourists? Possibly. Nothing is designed. And you'd keep the farmhouse, but they'd own the drive? There would be access terms, so you'd live inside their business. I currently live inside mine. That's different. It is mine. Elise tapped the advisory agreement. 20 hours a week on paper. We both know what you do when a pipe breaks. I hold the flashlight now. You held it for almost an hour last week. How do you know? Calvin told Daniel. Daniel told me. Ruth looked toward the window. Wind lifted the first dry leaves from the yard and pressed them against the screen. You two discuss me thoroughly. We're trying to keep each other from saying the wrong thing. It isn't working. Elise pushed the proposals away. The development offer gives you a clean ending. Clean for whom? For you. For all of us. There it is again. Yes, there it is. I am part of this family. Daniel is part of this family. You don't get to act shocked that we have feelings about the place where we grew up. You're allowed feelings. Are we allowed to want it gone? Ruth was quiet. Elise leaned back. That's what nobody says. Daniel talks about money. I talk about your health. But I want it gone. I want one Christmas where weather isn't a guest. I want to drive past this road and not feel guilty because you're here alone checking pipes. You could visit without a crisis. That's not fair. No, it isn't. Elise's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. Dad died at this table. George had collapsed beside his chair after breakfast, one hand still gripping a page of spray records. Ruth had called emergency services, then Daniel, then Elise. By the time the ambulance arrived, she had known. The binoculars are in a box. You know what I mean. Ruth looked at George's chair. Do you think selling the table changes where he died? No. I think leaving might change where you live. The wind moved harder against the house. One of the porch geraniums tipped and struck the boards with a hollow clay sound. Ruth went outside. Elise followed. Together they lifted the pot. The red blooms were ragged but intact. Elise gathered spilled soil with her bare hands, while Ruth held the plant upright. I don't know what I want, Ruth said. Elise pressed soil around the roots. Then say no to both. You think they'll wait? If the choice is wrong because it has a deadline, let it be wrong. Ruth looked at her daughter's dirt-darkened fingers. For once, Elise was not tidying anything. She was trying to put back what the wind had disturbed. The next day, Vale Cider Works emailed a list of proposed revisions before Ruth had requested any. Health insurance eligibility for permanent staff, a minimum advisory payment regardless of crop volume, a separate budget for replacing the north compressor in the first year. Daniel forwarded the message to Ruth with one sentence. They are selling harder. At 4 that afternoon, the weather radio warned of damaging gusts overnight. Calvin secured empty bins. Nora backed up order files and wrapped the label printer in plastic in case the roof leaked. Ruth moved the geraniums into the mudroom. She was in bed when the wind began. It came first as a low pressure against the walls, then in hard bursts that rattled the old sash windows. At 1:17, the power failed. Ruth lay in the dark listening. A deeper crack sounded from beyond the house, followed by the long, tearing noise of wood giving way. She reached for her phone. Before she could switch on the flashlight, it rang. Calvin's name glowed on the screen. Access lane, he said when she answered. Wind roared around his voice. Big trees down across it. How big? Big enough that morning trucks aren't getting through. Ruth pulled on her clothes. I'm coming. Outside, the orchard was moving in the dark. Branches bent, leaves flew backward, and somewhere below the hill, metal slammed repeatedly against metal. For the first time since the offers arrived, Ruth did not think about which future was worth more. She thought about who would answer when she called. The first person Ruth called was Nora. The second was Anna Morales, who supervised one of the picking crews and lived 10 minutes away. The third was Gerald Tucker, whose cattle farm bordered the western side of the orchard and whose skid steer had pulled Ruth's truck from mud twice. Then she called Daniel. He answered on the 7th ring. Mom, a tree is across the access lane. What time is it? 1:23. Is the house damaged? No. Are you? I'm putting on boots. Don't go outside in this. Trucks start arriving at 6:30. They won't come in this weather. They'll come late and angry. Daniel breathed into the phone. She could hear him sit up. Call the truck companies. Cancel the pickups. We have standing orders. It's a storm. It'll be morning when they arrive. I can come after 8. Why after 8? Silence stretched just long enough to answer her. My lender meeting, he said. They moved it once already. Ruth sat on the edge of her bed. Wind pushed rain against the glass in a hard sheet. How serious is it? The meeting or the restaurant? Both. I can't miss it. That was an answer, if not the one she wanted. I'll call you after, he said. Promise me you won't use a chainsaw. I don't use a chainsaw. You own 3. So, do sensible people who hire Calvin. She hung up and called Elise. Her daughter answered immediately, fully awake. What happened? Ruth explained. Can you get out through the west service track, not with the washout by the creek? Do you need me? The question arrived without hesitation. Ruth nearly said yes. What do you have in the morning? A hotel installation, 6 vendors, furniture delivery at 7. If I'm not there, the loading dock won't release anything. Ruth pictured Elise in some half-finished lobby, standing between crates and a manager with a clipboard. Work was allowed to matter, even when it belonged to her children. Stay there, she said. I can cancel. No. Bring food later. What kind? Edible. That narrows it. Drive carefully. Ruth put the phone in her coat pocket and stepped outside. Rain struck sideways. The power failure had erased every familiar point of light, leaving only the pale beam from her flashlight and the shadowed movement of trees. She did not go toward the access lane. Calvin knew fallen timber. Her first job was to find the metal she had heard. A section of flashing had peeled from the packing house roof and was slamming against the gutter. Ruth stood well clear and called Calvin. Leave it, he shouted over the phone. If it comes loose, it comes loose. Water will get over the grading line. Then get Nora to move the covers. Don't climb anything. I wasn't going to climb. You looked at the ladder. She had. Nora arrived in an old pickup with one headlight brighter than the other. Anna came behind her with 2 workers who had been scheduled for 7 but had volunteered when she called. Gerald reached the blocked lane from the roadside, his skid steer's work lights glowing beyond the fallen tree. The tree was a red oak, not one of the orchard trees. Its roots had lifted a wall of earth taller than Calvin. The trunk lay across the gravel and into the drainage ditch, branches tangled in the utility line that served the packing house. No cutting until the power company clears the wire, Calvin said. It's already out, Gerald shouted from the other side. Out is not dead. Gerald raised both hands in surrender. Ruth called the emergency number for the electric cooperative. The dispatcher said crews were dealing with dozens of downed lines and could not estimate arrival. Then we clear the branch end and open the service track, Ruth said. Creek crossing is soft, Calvin warned. Empty trucks only. Loaded ones leave after the lane opens. Nora had already moved the morning orders away from the leaking section of roof. She and Anna covered the grading belt with heavy plastic, weighted it with empty trays, and relocated the label stock. Water found its way through 2 new places. By 4, 7 adults were working beneath battery lanterns. No one waited for Ruth to assign every task. Gerald called his brother, who owned a portable generator large enough to run the south cold storage unit. Anna contacted both drivers in Spanish and English and revised their arrival times. Nora found dry socks in the office cabinet because she kept dry socks everywhere. Ruth moved between them with a clipboard sealed inside a freezer bag. She did not lift the limbs Calvin cut from the safe side of the tree. She did not drag the generator cable. She checked temperatures, called customers, found diesel, and remembered that Gerald's brother drank his coffee with canned milk. At 5:15, the wind weakened. Dawn revealed the damage gradually. A dozen young trees leaned at severe angles. 2 older wine saps had split. The flashing hung twisted from the packing house roof. Leaves and small apples covered the ground so thickly that the upper hill looked pelted. It was damage, not destruction. Ruth felt grateful and tired enough to resent having to distinguish between them. The power company arrived at 6:10. Once the line was declared safe, Calvin and Gerald cut the oak into sections. The skid steer pushed the trunk clear at 7:28. The first truck came through at 7:35. Its driver rolled down his window. "Heard you had a tree down." "We moved it," Ruth said. He looked at the stump, the crew, and the mud covering everyone. "I see that." By 8, the grading line was running on generator power. At 8:15, Nora handed Ruth a cup of coffee and half a biscuit Anna had brought. "You called Daniel?" Nora asked. "He has a meeting." "Of course he does. It matters." So did the tree. Ruth drank the coffee. Both can be true. Nora watched Calvin guide the first pallet toward the truck. That attitude is why people keep getting away with things around you. That attitude is why you still work here. No, The dental insurance is why I still work here. We don't offer dental. Exactly. I'm trapped by hope. Daniel arrived at 9:40, wearing a navy suit and no tie. Mud splashed his trousers before he reached the loading dock. "You're all right," he said, disappointed. He ignored that and surveyed the roof. How bad? Flashing. 2 split trees, 12 leaning. Power may be out all day. The lane, open. You should have waited. For what? For me. You said after 8. I left the meeting early. How did it go? His expression answered before he did. They extended the line for 60 days. That's all? It's enough. For what? To close the sale or find an investor? Ruth looked at him. Which sale? His jaw tightened. Don't do that. You're counting on Graham's offer. I'm counting on you making a rational decision. You offered fruit that wasn't ripe because a customer had a Friday promotion. Now your lender has a 60-day deadline, and you want me to believe it has nothing to do with your advice. I told you I'm not asking for a rescue. You're just waiting near the boat. Daniel looked toward the workers. Can we not discuss this here? They already know more about the condition of my business than I know about yours. This is not your business. No, it's your emergency attached to my sale. His face changed. Not anger first. Shame. Ruth regretted the sentence before it finished hurting him, but she did not take it back. Daniel stared at the mud on his shoes. If the restaurant closes, 23 people lose jobs. It was the first time he had given the consequence a number. You think I'm buying vacations? He asked. You think I want a bigger kitchen? I'm trying to keep the doors open. By spending money you don't have. Yes. The word came out hard. Because sometimes you keep something alive through a bad year. You, of all people, should understand that. Behind them, the grading line started with a heavy mechanical thump. Apples began rolling beneath the brushes. Ruth looked at her son. He was frightened. He was also trying to use her life to repair his choices. Both could be true. I understand, she said. That doesn't make the orchard yours to spend. He nodded once, as if she had confirmed something. Then he took off his suit jacket, hung it on a nail, and asked Calvin where to help. He stayed 4 hours. He hauled cut limbs, fetched fuel, and climbed no ladders because Ruth told him not to. When Elise arrived after noon with chili, cornbread, coffee, and enough paper bowls for twice the crew, Daniel was beside Gerald, filling ruts in the access lane. Elise looked at Ruth. How bad? Everyone keeps asking that. Because you look terrible. Thank you. I meant tired. Worse. They fed the crew in the packing house. No one made speeches. Calvin ate 3 bowls of chili. Nora criticized the cornbread for containing sugar, and then took another piece. Paul Vale called while Ruth was scraping mud from her boots. We heard about the storm, he said. Are you safe? Yes. Trees? 2 old ones split. Young stock leaning. Packing house flashing came loose. A pause. Do you want us to delay anything? Ruth looked across the room. Daniel was laughing at something Gerald said. Elise sat on an overturned crate beside Anna, holding a paper bowl on her knee. No, Ruth said. I want you to see the damage. Paul did not offer sympathy, disguised as optimism. We can come tomorrow. The Vales arrived with boots and notebooks, not chainsaws. Calvin walked the blocks with them, while Ruth showed Marin the uprooted oak and damaged roof. They examined the split wine saps. One could be cut back and possibly survive. The other had opened through the main trunk. This doesn't change your proposal? Ruth asked. It changes the repair estimate, Marin said. Not why we're interested. You're certain? No. We're never certain. That's why we inspect. The answer pleased Ruth more than reassurance would have. In the office, she asked the Vales what would happen to Nora and Calvin beyond their stated intention to hire them. Paul answered carefully. We can guarantee offers at their current base pay. We can't guarantee they'll accept or that the relationship will work forever. Health insurance for full-time employees after 60 days. Dental, Nora called through the open door. Marin leaned toward it. Optional dental. Nora appeared. Now we negotiate. They discussed hours, authority, equipment budgets, and what Ruth's advisory role would exclude. No emergency calls after agreed hours unless she chose to answer. No climbing, spraying, or lifting above 20 pounds. Ruth objected to 15, accepted 20, and refused language requiring weekend tasting events. After the Vales left, Ruth asked Nora and Calvin to remain. If I choose them, do you want to stay? Calvin said. Maybe. Nora said, that is not how you ask employees a question. How should I ask? What changes? Who decides schedules? Do we report to you or them? What happens when your advice and their money disagree? I don't know yet. Then we don't know yet. Ruth nodded. Fair. Nora softened. I'd consider it. So would I, Calvin said. Long as nobody says workflow. That evening, Ruth called Meredith. I want counters prepared for both offers, she said. Graham shortens the contingency period and increases the non-refundable deposit after county review. The Vale's guarantee staff offers, define my hours, replace the North compressor before next summer, and leave me final approval over use of the Mercer name during my advisory term. Anything else? Yes? The 6 acres around the house include the kitchen garden, the old sign in the barn, and enough of the south row that I'm not staring at a parking lot. Meredith's pen moved across paper. Are you closer to deciding? She asked. Ruth watched workers' headlights leave one by one through the cleared lane. Yes, she said. She was closer. That was not the same as being ready to tell her children which futures she had begun to mourn. Meredith sent the revised proposals Friday afternoon. Graham's group agreed to shorten the initial review period, increase the deposit after county approval, and let Ruth remain in the farmhouse for 6 months after closing instead of 90 days. They would not exclude the house from the sale. Their planners considered its location essential to the entrance design. The Vales accepted the staff guarantees, health coverage language, compressor replacement, and limits on Ruth's hours. They agreed that Nora would direct packing operations and Calvin would direct field crews during the transition, both reporting to Marin on budget and expansion decisions. Ruth would retain approval over the Mercer name for 3 years. The 6-acre boundary could include the kitchen garden and south row, but the old sign was personal property, whether it stood inside the boundary or not. They wrote a sentence about the sign, Nora asked. I requested one. You know you can carry a sign. Now I can carry it contractually. Nora adjusted her purple glasses. Rich people have strange hobbies. I'm not rich. You have 2 offers and a sign clause? Ruth placed the proposal side by side on George's desk. Graham's was shorter. Land, contingencies, money, departure. The Valeses had grown thick with questions about labor, trees, hours, equipment, names, and who answered when something broke. The office printer started behind her. Ruth turned. No one had sent a document from the office computer. 3 pages slid into the tray. The first was an email calendar invitation addressed to Daniel. Accelerated Decision Discussion, Graham Lowell Group. Beneath it, a note from Graham's assistant read, Per Daniel Mercer's request, we've made time to discuss whether a shorter acceptance window would help the family move forward. Ruth read it again. The printer produced a 4th page. This one had no email header. At the top, in Elise's preferred typeface, were the words, A New Chapter for Mercer Orchard. The paragraph below thanked customers and neighbors for supporting the Mercer family through decades of harvests and announced that Ruth would be stepping into a well-earned retirement as the property begins an exciting transformation. 2 alternatives followed, one warmer, one shorter, all written as if Ruth had already left. She heard the outer door open. Nora came in carrying packing slips. What's that? Ruth handed her the pages. Nora read the first and said nothing. On the announcement, her mouth flattened. They're drafts, Ruth said. Drafts of what they want. Yes. Did you know? No. The documents had probably printed because Elise's computer remained connected to the Orchard office printer from the tag spreadsheet. Ordinary carelessness, not confession. Daniel had used the Orchard email in his correspondence with Graham, and an automated copy had reached the printer. Neither child imagined Ruth standing there when their intentions came out on paper. Nora placed the pages on the desk. You want me to say something helpful? No. Good. Ruth folded the calendar invitation once, then unfolded it. I want Sunday supper. You think they deserve food? I want them sitting where I can see them. She telephoned both children. Daniel answered from his restaurant. Sunday is difficult. You can come at 6. What's happening? I'm deciding. He went silent. You have the revised offers? Yes. Do you want me to bring anything? Your appetite? Elise asked more questions. Ruth answered none. On Sunday, she roasted a chicken. She did not use rosemary. She made mashed potatoes, green beans, and an apple cake with a crisp corner for Daniel and a soft center for Elise. The familiar menu steadied her hands. They arrived separately. Daniel brought wine. Elise carried no flowers. Both looked first at the sideboard, where the two proposal folders sat beneath George's broken binoculars, which Ruth had unpacked that afternoon. No one mentioned them. They ate through the chicken. Daniel tried twice to discuss the storm repairs, as if agreeing about roof flashing might create a safe path toward larger things. Elise asked whether the geraniums had survived. "They're in the mudroom," Ruth said. "You should bring them back out while the weather's mild." "I will." The clock ticked. Plates emptied. Ruth served cake before she began. I countered both proposals. Daniel's fork stopped. "Without us?" "With Meredith." "What did you ask for?" she explained. Graham's shortened review, the increased deposit, the Vale's employment terms, compressor, boundaries, limits, and sign. Daniel listened without interrupting. Elise asked practical questions about access to the house and whether Ruth could sell the retained land later. Her calm made Ruth wonder if they had agreed beforehand which one would argue and which would appear reasonable. "The development offer is still substantially higher," Daniel said when Ruth finished. "Yes, and now less risky." "Somewhat." "You'd have 6 months to move." "I don't want 6 months to move." "Mom," Ruth held up a hand. "There's more." She went to the sideboard and brought back the printed pages. First, she set the calendar invitation in front of Daniel. Color drained from his face. "It wasn't what it looks like. It looks like you asked Graham to pressure me." I asked whether they could accelerate their response. "My lender wanted a realistic timeline." "Your lender?" "I told Graham there were family considerations." "You used my decision as evidence in your meeting." "I said there was a pending property offer." "Pending means undecided." "I know what pending means." "Do you?" Elise picked up the invitation. "You told me you were only keeping communication open." "I was." "You asked them for a shorter deadline." "To focus the process." Ruth placed the announcement drafts beside Elise's plate. Her daughter recognized them instantly. "Those weren't finished. They appeared finished enough to retire me. I drafted options." "For whom?" "For the customers, the community. People are going to talk no matter what you decide. One says the property is beginning a transformation. That version was for the developer sale. A sale I had not chosen. I make drafts for every project." "Did you draft one for the Vales?" Elise's mouth opened, then closed. Ruth nodded. "That's what I thought." Daniel pushed the invitation away. "All right, we moved too fast. We've admitted that before." "No. You say you moved too fast after I catch up to where you've gone. That doesn't invalidate the offer." "I didn't say it did." "Then what are we doing?" Ruth looked at them across the table. Daniel's crisp corner of cake remained untouched. Elise had sliced her soft piece into narrow strips. "We're talking about the two futures," Ruth said. "The development sale pays the most. After review and approval, they take all the land, all the buildings, and the house. I maintain the orchard while they decide whether the county will let them destroy it. At closing, I leave. They don't destroy the land," Elise said quietly. "They destroy the orchard." Elise nodded once. "The Vales pay less. They buy 36 acres in the business. They preserve most of the productive blocks, replace some over time, keep Nora and Calvin employed if they accept, and build cider production. I retain my house and 6 acres. I advise for 3 years with limits." Daniel's voice was controlled. "And then they own the orchard forever." "Yes." "So either way, you lose it." "Yes." That word silenced him. Ruth had not let herself say it plainly until then. Selling to people who valued her did not turn sale into triumph. The Vales would make decisions she disliked. Trees she planted would come out. Her office would become someone else's. She would stand on 6 acres and watch trucks cross a lane she no longer owned. "I'm choosing the Vales," she said. Daniel stared at her. Elise's face became very still, the way it did when she was containing something strong enough to embarrass her. "No," Daniel said. Ruth had expected anger. The bare refusal was worse. "You asked me to listen to offers." "I did." "You can't throw away $1.3 million because 2 people admired your apples. The offers covered different things. You know what I mean." "I do." He stood. "What am I supposed to do in 60 days? There it was. Not an inheritance someday. A deadline already spending her choice. "You make a plan for your restaurant," Ruth said. This was the plan. I never agreed to that. You knew I was in trouble. I knew after you arranged the valuation. I wasn't asking for all of it. You weren't asking at all. You were preparing to receive. His chair remained angled from the table. He gripped its back. Dad would never have done this, he said. Ruth felt George's absence enter the room like cold air. Your father wrote down every check we gave you, she said. He wanted repayment. I told him family did not keep a ledger. Daniel's eyes shifted. I was wrong, she continued. Not because you owed us money, because I used money instead of speaking honestly. I rescued you, then resented what it cost without telling you. That was unfair. He looked almost relieved until she said, I will not do it again. Elise stood too. So that's it? You choose strangers. I choose an offer. They asked only for you. Do you have any idea what that felt like? Yes. No, you don't. You think it proved they respected you. To me, it proved we were furniture in our own family story. Ruth pushed her chair back. Those strangers asked what I knew, what I wanted, and what it would cost me to stay. You two asked how soon I would leave. We were trying to give you a life. I already have one. A lonely one, Elise said. The words stayed between them. Ruth could have denied it. She was lonely. She had also been lonely at Sunday suppers with 2 children planning her absence. Lonely does not mean available for rearrangement, she said. Elise picked up her purse. I can't do this tonight. You don't have to. That is always your answer. We don't have to stay. We don't have to help. We don't have to understand. Then you act hurt when we go. Ruth wanted to stop her. She wanted to apologize, accuse, and hold on, all at once. Instead, she said, I am hurt. Elise looked at her, tears bright in her eyes. So am I. She left. Daniel remained long enough to put the wine in the refrigerator, a ridiculous act of manners that nearly undid Ruth. At the door, he said, Ash Oak may close. I'm sorry. No checkbook? Ruth held his gaze. No. He nodded and walked out. Ruth listened to both vehicles leave. Then she cleared the table, wrapped the untouched cake, and washed 3 plates. She left George's chair where it was. In the morning, she called Meredith and authorized her to proceed with the veil proposal. Then Ruth went down to the orchard and told Nora and Calvin before anyone else could print their future for them. Nora did not celebrate. She leaned against the grating table, arms folded, while Calvin stood beside a pallet of wine saps with his hands in his jacket pockets. You chose them, Nora said. I authorize Meredith to proceed. That's broker language. Yes, I chose them. Calvin looked toward the open loading door. Daniel know? He attended supper. That bad? He didn't eat cake. Nora winced. Severe. Ruth explained the staff terms, the proposed reporting structure, and the 60-day health insurance wait. Nora asked whether her unused vacation would transfer. Calvin wanted to know who owned the trucks. Neither question appeared in the proposal. I'll find out, Ruth said. Nora shook her head. No, they find out. If they're buying a business, they can learn to answer questions. The Vales returned 2 days later and met with the staff individually. Ruth remained in the office until Nora asked her to leave. You wanted us to choose, Nora said. We can't choose with you making your face. What face? The one that says, remember who paid you during the bad peach year. I don't have that face. You were born with it. Ruth went outside. Survey stakes had appeared near the kitchen garden that morning, thin wooden strips topped with pink ribbon. One stood between 2 hydrangeas George had planted badly. Another divided the yard 10 feet closer to the house than Ruth expected. She pulled neither out. The surveyor returned after lunch and explained that the line was preliminary. Ruth walked the proposed boundary with him, Meredith, Paul, and Marin. They shifted it to preserve the garden, the hydrangeas, the tool shed, and access to the south row. Every shift required another somewhere else. 6 acres, Ruth discovered, became small the moment she cared where each foot went. At the back of the house, Marin pointed toward the equipment lane. Cider trucks will use that route. You'll hear them. I hear trucks now. More trucks. How many? 2 or 3 a week outside harvest, possibly daily during pressing. Ruth looked toward her bedroom window. Daniel would have called the noise proof that the house was not a gift. Elise would have designed a buffer of trees and fencing. Ruth had no one beside her translating inconvenience into objection. Put delivery hours in the agreement, she said. Nothing before 7 or after 8 except emergencies. Paul made a note. Define emergency, Ruth added. He looked up. You don't trust us. I'm learning how. The veils did not flatter her during the next 6 weeks. They questioned the cost of hand-sorting premium fruit. Marin proposed removing a row of Arkansas black trees that had produced poorly for 3 seasons. Paul thought the packing house needed a concrete floor in the pressing area, which would eliminate the corner where Nora stored spare cartons. They rejected Ruth's suggestion that the old truck could last another winter. It starts, Ruth said. Sometimes, Calvin said. You are not helping. I want a new truck. Ruth and Marin argued for 40 minutes about pruning labor. Ruth accused her of applying cider margins to fresh fruit work. Marin accused Ruth of preserving inefficient practices because George had established them. My husband did not establish color picking, Ruth said. I know, you did. The correction did not soften the disagreement. They compromised on a trial. 1 block would be pruned under the Vale's proposed schedule, a comparable block under Ruth's. Yield and labor hours would be measured. Ruth left the meeting irritated and unexpectedly reassured. Marin wanted her knowledge. She did not want obedience to it. Due diligence transformed the orchard into a place covered in temporary labels. An equipment appraiser photographed tractors. An electrician opened panels no one had opened in years and made noises that increased his estimate. The lender inspected the cold rooms. Soil technicians carried samples away in plastic sleeves. Ruth answered questions until she heard them in her sleep. How old was the south pump? Which employees lived on site? Were verbal agreements in place with neighboring growers? Had the creek ever crossed the packing house floor? Who owned the propane tank? The propane company owned the tank. Ruth had known that. George had argued about the rental charge every January. She found the agreement in a filing cabinet beneath warranties for equipment they no longer had. On the folder, George had written thieves in red pencil. Ruth laughed alone in the office, then sat with the folder in her lap until laughter became something else. She took home his calculator, the red maintenance folder, and the photograph of Daniel and Elise standing beside a harvest bin in 1992. She left the filing cabinets, the desk, and George's coffee mug with its faded tractor. Marin found her wrapping the mug in newspaper. That can stay, she said. It's mine. I meant you don't have to empty the office. I know. The advisory agreement gave Ruth continued use of the office, but not ownership of it. The distinction seemed foolish until she tried leaving a sweater over the chair. Every object became a question. Was she staying or failing to leave? She carried the mug home. Daniel called twice during those weeks. The first time, he asked whether the Vale agreement had been signed. The second, he asked for the name of the accountant Ruth used when George died. Why, she asked. I'm selling ash oak. Ruth sat down at the kitchen table. The building? I lease the building. The buyer wants the name, equipment, liquor license transfer, and catering contracts. Will it cover the lender? Most of it. And the rest? I'll have a payment plan. She pressed her fingers into the table's old scratch. I could, no. The word came quickly. I wasn't offering. You started to. I was going to ask if you needed the accountant. I have an accountant. Then, why did you ask for mine? Because mine helped me get here. Ruth accepted that. When is the last service? She asked. Saturday? Do you want me there? A pause. Do what you want. It was not an invitation. It was not a refusal. She went. Ash oak occupied the ground floor of a brick building near the river. With tall windows and a black awning Daniel had replaced the previous spring. Ruth arrived alone at 6, gave her name to the host, and was shown to a 2-person table against the wall. The dining room was nearly full. People had come because word of the closing had spread. Some hugged Daniel when he passed. Others took photographs of their plates. Ruth had eaten there many times, but always as Daniel's mother. A server would say the chef was sending something special, and the check would never come. That night, no one appeared to know who she was. She ordered the roast chicken. It arrived with parsnip puree, bitter greens, and cider sauce. A version of the meal Daniel had cooked for the Vales, though the chicken was not dry. Halfway through, Daniel came out of the kitchen. He wore a white chef's coat with ash oak stitched above his heart. Sweat darkened his collar. You came. You said to do what I wanted. I didn't think you would. That was careless. He looked toward the kitchen doors. How is it? Better than yours at the house. He laughed once. It made him look younger. "Sit down," Ruth said. "I can't." "Of course not." His face tightened at the words. "I meant you're busy," she said. "Right? People love this place. People love funerals. They make us remember to show up." Ruth put down her fork. "I'm sorry, Daniel." "For which thing?" "All the ones you'll let me be sorry for." He looked away. A server passed carrying 2 steaks. From the kitchen came the sharp call of an order, then the answer from the line. "I took a job," Daniel said. "Executive kitchen manager at a hotel in Richmond." Executive. It means I make schedules and explain food costs to people who call guests a revenue stream. You'll be good at that. Don't sound relieved. I'm not. You are a little. Ruth considered lying. "A little," he nodded. "I know selling hurts," she said. Daniel looked back at her. "Do you?" "Yes." "Your name stays on yours for 3 years. Then they can ask me again. And you keep the house." "Yes." "And 2.1 million before costs and taxes." He almost smiled. "You sound like Meredith." The kitchen doors swung open. Someone called his name. "I have to go." "Daniel?" He stopped. "You kept 23 people working longer than the numbers said you should. That isn't a compliment if the place still closes. It can be both." He looked at her for a long moment, then returned to the kitchen. The check arrived after dessert. Ruth paid it and left a tip large enough that George would have objected. Elise did not call. Ruth sent one message after the sale agreement was finalized. "I wanted you to hear from me. We expect to close on November 30th. No answer came. A week later, a package arrived containing Ruth's house key and the orchard office key Elise had carried since George became ill. No note. The keys were wrapped in tissue paper, not dropped loose into an envelope. Even angry, Elise could not bear to let metal scratch. Ruth placed the house key in the kitchen drawer. She returned the office key to Marin. "You can keep it," Marin said. "You'll need one." "Not that one." Marin seemed to understand. At the next meeting, she handed Ruth a new key on a plain steel ring. The lender's final review almost delayed closing. An estimate for upgrading wastewater handling came in higher than expected, and the Vales asked to move part of the equipment payment into the second year. Ruth said no. Paul explained the cash flow problem. Ruth explained that she would not finance equipment she no longer controlled. They spent 2 difficult days considering whether to reduce the included machinery or postpone the entire sale. Calvin solved nothing, but he identified 3 pieces of equipment the Vales did not need and Ruth could sell separately. The resulting adjustment was modest. It closed enough of the gap for the Vales to proceed, without asking Ruth to carry their risk. "Useful man," Paul said. "Don't tell him," Ruth replied. The north compressor failed the week before closing. It gave one metallic shriek at 4 in the morning and died. Ruth transferred the remaining fruit to South Storage and called Marin instead of Amos. For 10 seconds after the call, she stood with the silent unit and waited for guilt. None came. The replacement was the Vales' responsibility under the agreement. Marin handled the bids. Paul arranged temporary storage with another grower. Ruth advised them which fruit could tolerate transport and went home at noon. On November 30th, she sat beside Meredith in a conference room with no view of the orchard. Paul and Marin sat across from her. Papers moved around the table. Questions were asked and answered. Ruth signed her name until it looked misspelled. No one applauded. At the end, Paul slid the new office key toward her. Ruth held it without picking it up. The orchard was no longer hers. The house was. The garden was. 6 acres, the old sign, George's calculator, and every choice she made after leaving that room were hers. She put the key in her pocket. Outside the conference room, Meredith hugged her. It surprised Ruth. Meredith had conducted the entire closing with the emotional temperature of a filing cabinet, then put both arms around her beside a water cooler. "You did well," Meredith said. "I signed where you pointed. You decided before that." Ruth drove home through bare fields. The trees had lost nearly all their leaves, exposing the dark structure of the rows. Survey markers still stood around her 6 acres. They were no longer suggestions. At the new boundary, she slowed. Paul's truck was parked beside the packing house. Marin stood on the loading dock with Nora, both looking at a clipboard. Calvin drove the old tractor across the center slope without glancing toward the road. Ruth parked at the house and carried George's calculator inside. The kitchen was cold. She switched on the light, placed the calculator in a drawer beside takeout menus she had managed to save from Elise, then took it out again. She set it on the counter. At 4, her phone rang. Marin said, "The compressor installer can start Monday. They want access at 6:30. Then give it to them. I'm asking whether that conflicts with packing. Ask Nora." A short silence followed. "You're right," Marin said. Ruth stood at the window, watching the last light leave the south row. She had expected relief when someone else became responsible. Instead, each transferred decision felt like a small door closing. Marin called again before hanging up. "We're having a staff meeting at 8 tomorrow. You're welcome, but it isn't one of your scheduled days." Ruth looked at the new office key on her ring. "I won't be there." The next morning, she woke at 5:14 and remained in bed. At 5:27, she got up. She made coffee, sat in George's chair, and listened to trucks arrive below the house. At 7:50, she put on her coat and walked as far as the kitchen garden. She could see the packing house lights through the bare branches. She did not go down. At 9, Nora appeared at the back door, carrying 2 cinnamon rolls. "I thought you had a staff meeting," Ruth said. "Finished. You're supposed to report to Marin now," I reported. "She used an agenda. Did it hurt? I may recover." They ate at the kitchen table. Nora described the meeting without being asked. The Vales planned to repair the roof in sections, convert 1 storage room for pressing, and hire 2 additional full-time workers before spring. The north compressor installation would take 3 days. "What did they decide about the spare cartons?" Ruth asked. Nora pointed a cinnamon-coated finger at her. "Advisory hours. That is not a real answer. It is now." Ruth sat back. Nora softened. "We moved them to the west wall. The west wall sweats." "I know." "Then why?" "I'm joking. They're where they were." Ruth laughed, unwillingly at first. Her advisory schedule began with 3 days a week: Monday for production planning, Wednesday for orchard blocks, Friday for local grower relationships, and whatever the Vales had failed to categorize. The first Monday, Ruth arrived at 6:45. Marin arrived at 7 and pointed to the agreement. 8, she said. "I was awake. That isn't billable. I'm not billing for 45 minutes. That is how 20 hours becomes 40. Ruth walked back to the house, offended for most of the distance and grateful for the rest. The new compressor started on a cold Thursday morning with a soft mechanical hum, almost disappointingly quiet. Amos came to inspect it, pronounced it unnecessarily modern, and asked who wanted his final bill. Paul did. Ruth watched him carry the invoice into the office and felt no urge to follow. Winter reduced the orchard to its bones. Calvin's trial pruning blocks became visible from the road. One opened more aggressively beneath Marin's plan, the other shaped according to Ruth's. They argued over cuts, recorded labor, and agreed to wait for bloom before either declared victory. On Tuesdays, Ruth began driving beyond the farm supply intersection. Sometimes she went to the overlook. Sometimes she sat in the bakery with a book and ordered the almond pastry. The woman with magenta hair learned her name and stopped explaining the menu. Ruth bought a small radio for the kitchen. She moved George's chair away from the head of the table and angled it toward the window, where she could sit in it without turning every meal into a memorial. She left his binoculars broken. Daniel came for supper in February. He wore hotel trousers and a shirt embroidered with the name of a chain Ruth had never considered elegant enough to employ the word executive. He brought a bottle of wine bought from a store. "How is revenue streaming?" she asked. "Profitable." "That sounds vulgar. It has benefits." He said the last word with exaggerated importance. "Health insurance?" Ruth asked. "Dental too?" "I know someone who'd marry you. They ate pot roast." Daniel described a corporate meeting where 4 managers debated whether parsley should be included in the banquet package photograph. Ruth told him Nora had nearly signed an employment contract based on dental coverage. They spoke around Ash Oak until the dishes were cleared. Finally, Daniel said, "The new owner changed the menu." Ruth set down a plate. "It belongs to him." "I know. Does the chicken stay?" He turned it into a sandwich. "That is hard. It's a good sandwich. That is harder." Daniel dried the plate she had washed. "I kept thinking I'd failed because I couldn't save the restaurant," he said. "Now I think I failed earlier." "When?" "When every bad month became a reason to borrow against the next good one." Ruth handed him another plate. "I knew," he continued, "not the whole time, but long enough. Why didn't you close?" He looked at the dish towel in his hands. 23 people. Yes. And pride. Yes. And because opening it was the last thing Dad said he was proud of before he got sick. Ruth leaned against the sink. George had complained about the risk, the location, the cost of the ovens, and the interest rate. At the opening, he had worn a jacket that did not fit and told every table his son had built the place from nothing. "He was proud of you before that," Ruth said. "He didn't say it much." "No, neither do you." The old defense rose automatically. She had paid his tuition, worked extra contracts, driven food to his first kitchen, sat through empty lunch services. She let the list pass without speaking. "I'm proud of you for taking the hotel job," she said. Daniel's mouth tightened. "That still sounds like relief." "It is relief. It is also pride. I can have both." He folded the towel over the oven handle. "I still think you should have taken Graham's offer. I know, but the hotel bought 6 cases of Mercer cider for spring events. There is no Mercer cider yet. There will be." Paul came to a tasting. Ruth looked at him. "You met Paul?" He asked whether the hotel buys regional beverages. I gave him the purchasing manager's name. "You helped him?" "I made an introduction. Don't turn it into a reconciliation montage." "I don't know what that is." "Good." He stayed for cake. Elise did not. Spring reached the orchard through swelling buds and muddy boots. Pink appeared in the peach rose first, then white across the apples. The pruning trial produced no clear victor. Marin's block bloomed more evenly. Ruth's held more fruiting wood. They agreed to measure again after thinning. Ruth sent Elise a photograph of the first pippin bloom. No answer came. She sent nothing else. When the winesaps finished flowering, Ruth found a flat box on the back porch. Inside were plastic sleeves, acid-free labels, and a printed inventory of the grafting tags recovered from the disposal trailer. Elise's notes filled the margins. One line at the bottom read, "I still have 23 that need matching." Ruth carried the box to the packing house and spread everything across the table where the wet tags had once dried. Elise arrived the following Saturday. She parked at the house rather than below the new ownership sign. For several minutes, she remained in her car. Ruth watched from the porch without going to meet her. When Elise finally got out, she carried her laptop and 2 coffees. "I don't know how you drink yours anymore," she said. "Black." "I got black." They went to the packing house. It was quiet on Saturdays outside Harvest. The pressing room conversion had begun, leaving one wall stripped to studs. The grading tables remained untouched. Elise opened the spreadsheet. For an hour they discussed only tags. One marked upper 11, late gold, could have belonged to either of 2 trial trees. Ruth could not remember which. Elise did not insist that she try harder. She labeled it uncertain. The 23rd tag carried only a faded date and the letters E-L-I. Elise turned it beneath the light. "Is that my name? It's probably Ellison's orange." "Oh, you helped graft it. When?" "You were home after your divorce. You couldn't sleep, so you came outside before sunrise." Elise stared at the tag. "I don't remember. You complained about the knife." "That sounds right. You made the cut crooked." "It took anyway." Elise entered the location. After a while, she said, "I thought if the orchard sold for enough, it would make sense." "What would?" "All of it. Dad missing things. You being tired. Daniel and me always coming second when something froze or broke." She kept her eyes on the screen. "The money would prove it had been worth what it cost us." Ruth folded an empty plastic sleeve along its seam. "Money doesn't prove that." "I know. It also doesn't repay it. I know that too." Ruth looked at her daughter's careful hands. "I should have left more often." Elise blinked. "I told myself the orchard needed me. Sometimes it did. Sometimes I needed it to need me." The packing house refrigerator clicked on in the silence. "Dad missed Daniel's graduation because of hail," Ruth said. "But I could have gone without him. I stayed because he was angry, and I thought married people should suffer together." Elise gave a wet laugh. "That does sound married. I let you blame the orchard because it was easier than saying we made choices." "You made bad ones." "Yes." Elise closed the laptop. "I made some too. You threw away my tags. I was thinking of something more recent." Ruth waited. "I shouldn't have drafted the announcement." "No. I thought if I wrote the future cleanly enough, you'd want it. You've always trusted typefaces too much." Elise smiled, then began to cry. Ruth moved around the table. She did not tell her daughter everything was forgiven. She put an arm around her and let the unfinished parts remain unfinished. When they returned to the house, Elise stopped beside the new boundary stake near the hydrangeas. 6 acres feels smaller than I pictured. It grows when somebody else mows the other 36. At the porch, Elise said, I can't come every Sunday. I didn't ask. I could come next Sunday. All right, no orchard meeting. We'll discuss your car. What's wrong with my car? Nothing. I need a subject ready. The first full harvest under the Vales began, hot and dry. Mercer cider orders exceeded the initial production estimate, helped by hotel accounts, regional stores, and restaurants that liked the old variety story. The success did not repair everything. A pump failed. One cider batch fermented too warm. The aggressively pruned trial block outperformed Ruth's in size and underperformed it in flavor, allowing both Ruth and Marin to claim victory. Nora took over production meetings. Calvin got his new truck. Ruth worked 3 days a week and occasionally 4, then recorded the extra hours because Marin made her. Daniel visited during the wine sap picking and did not give anyone instructions. Elise designed a simple display for the tasting room using the old double R sign, but only after asking Ruth, Nora, Paul, and Marin where it belonged. On the final blending afternoon, Paul lined 6 glasses across the office table. Marin asked Ruth to approve the blend carrying the Mercer name. Ruth tasted the first, then the second. Nora stood in the doorway holding a clipboard. What do you think, Ruth asked her, about the blend or being consulted after you've already tasted it? Both. Nora came in. Ruth stepped away from the glasses. You approve it. Marin looked at Ruth. You're sure? No, Ruth said. That's why it matters. She left them arguing pleasantly about acidity. Outside, harvest light lay gold across the upper hill. Workers were covering the last filled bins. Calvin raised one hand from the new truck. Ruth waved and kept walking. It was not yet 5. For most of her life, leaving before sunset in harvest season would have felt like negligence. At the boundary, she passed the old south row, still hers, its branches moving softly above the garden. Beyond it, the orchard continued without waiting for her. Lights glowed in the farmhouse kitchen. Daniel had brought dinner from the hotel. Elise's car stood beside his, badly parked. Through the open window came the sound of them disagreeing over whether the pot roast needed salt. Ruth climbed the porch steps in clean boots. Behind her, someone else answered the packing house telephone. She went inside and let them.